The American media and the bloggers, the mainstream media and the alternative media seem to be in a war. Who should American people trust? Who is the reliable source of information?
There is a war between the alternative media and the mainstream media. And you have thousands and thousands of sources in the alternative media. Some of it's true, some of it's lies. They all have agendas. And you have the government trying to infiltrate the blogs to put out their propaganda. The mainstream corporate media in the United States has proven they have an agenda to spin and lie and kind of dumb the information down. They lie by omission. The blogs are very diverse. Some of it's true, some of it's partially true, some of it's not true. But people are developing a sense and becoming more sophisticated, and they've learned that the alternative media is, on average, more accurate and delivers more diversity of thought and opinion than the mainstream media. And so the mainstream media is going bankrupt. TV's going bankrupt. The newspapers are going bankrupt. And it's not just because there's now the internet. It's because people have learned they have an agenda and are lying.
Then we're going to look at Ron Paul basically silenced at the CBS debate last night. Sure, on average, he gets about 4 minutes. The top candidate gets about 14. The other candidates get 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes, depending on which other candidate you're talking about. Scientific studies have been done on it in the last few months. The Drudge Report has reported on it and others. Well, last night, Mitt Romney got more than 12 minutes. Ron Paul got 89 seconds. 89 seconds. So they let him in the debate, but for all intents and purposes, he's not there. But he still scored multiple hole-in-ones, out of the parks, grand slams, whatever you want to call it, Hail Marys, in the 2 times he got to talk. Combined time, 89 seconds. I mean, they had him down to 4 minutes and change in the debates. First, it was 6 minutes down to 4 minutes. There's been like 10 of these things now. They're very popular. Folks are really waking up politically and looking for answers. And he got 89 seconds. By the way, that report is up at drudgereport.com right now. One of the top stories there. If you want to go there, it's an easy place to find it. It's also at infowars.com. He's linked to our posting on the subject at drudgereport.com if you'd like to find that. Drudge is always good at having things where they're easy to find. It's still on our front page, too, but our stuff scrolls off so fast. There it is. It's the top story, bottom top story in the top left-hand corner. Ron Paul gets 89 seconds to speak in debate. And we've got links to all the scientific studies and reports where Ron Paul gets the least amount of coverage, the least amount of time, and when he does, it's mainly negative. But on average, he gets about 4 minutes and 14 seconds in the studies we've got linked in a debate, in all the debates they've had. Well, now Ron Paul gets 89 seconds to speak in debate. Now CBS News has given him 89 seconds, and you can go look at Mitt Romney and the others, on average got more than 10 minutes. Ron Paul, in an hour-and-a-half debate, got 89 seconds, but he still did a great job in that time. But that shows you, and in every major poll, he's second, third, or fourth place. You actuary it together, he's number 3 going into number 2. That's it. You're at the debate. You get 89 seconds, buddy boy, with the cheers, 89 seconds. That's all the time you get. Now, Mitt Romney, 10-plus minutes. Everybody else, you get plenty of time because you're not a real threat. You're not intelligent. You're a bunch of teleprompter-reading political prostitutes that can't be trusted. If the American people don't vote for Ron Paul, well, we tried as best we could. We'll continue to fight on.
9 Republican presidential candidates squared off tonight in a debate hosted by Fox News and Google in Orlando, Florida. According to the latest Suffolk University poll, Mitt Romney is in the lead, with Ron Paul in second place at 14%. Joining me now is my friend and colleague, Fox News political analyst Juan Williams, author of Muzzled, The Assault on Honest Debate. You know we'll have honest debate here, my friend. There you go. All right, now, you got to tell me what you think of this headline in something called the Daily Caller. Quote, poll, Romney leads New Hampshire, Huntsman third, Perry fourth. Now, do they know how to count? Why would they omit saying who was in second?
Well, you know why? Ron Paul.
But is there a media bias against him? Just from the media's point of view, isn't he good for the media because he challenges Republican orthodoxy and causes debate and generates and stimulates the discussion about ideas that the other Republicans don't want to talk about?
Well, that's right. And it's because the other Republicans don't want to talk about it. It's because he is such an extraordinary candidate that the mainstream media doesn't pay attention. They don't believe that Ron Paul, with his libertarian bent, could actually be the GOP nominee. To the contrary, every time Ron Paul comes out, attracts huge crowds, gets numbers that are sufficient in the polls to say this could be your Republican nominee, there's a base of Republicans, but especially the mainstream media, that refuse to acknowledge. It's like he's standing in front of them and they say, I don't believe it. Don't believe it, not credible. I'm going to rub my eyes and see if I can. Oh, he's still there? Yeah, but who's first, who's third?
Is it a rejection of what he believes in? Is it just a perception that these numbers that we're seeing are not accurate and can't last?
Well, you know, part of the problem is that if you look at conventional mainstream Republican ideology, it's not isolationist. So some of the key issues that have erupted during our age, weapons of mass destruction, Iraq, Afghanistan, pursuit of Osama bin Laden, foreign aid, Israel, popped up this very week.
Right.
On all these fronts, what you hear for Ron Paul is contrary to Republican orthodoxy.
Okay,
Judge.
but you would agree with me, and obviously disagree if you feel inclined. The key issue is the economy.
Right.
No one has been stronger on what has caused these problems. No one has been more consistent. No one has done more to bring the Federal Reserve and money printing and central planning of economic activity into focus than Ron Paul. Is it possible Republicans and independents are recognizing that?
No, they're not recognizing it yet. And again, you know, what strikes me about this is I think Ron Paul is the father of the Tea Party, and in large part because of his criticism of U.S. economic policy and printing money, you know, willy-nilly, and saying that we are, in fact, out of control and we need to get back into some kind of very hard basis for currency. This is all Ron Paul. Okay. And saying spending is out of control and taxation is too much, and he's been back and forth with Perry in this debate and others about this issue. So here's what we know. In fact, he is, as you just described him, prescient when it comes to American economic problems, and yet people see him as, well, gee, that's Ron Paul. He's kind of, you know, curly-minded or curly-haired or whatever.
So now with Pawlenty dropping out, Rick Perry dropping in, and Michelle Bachmann and Ron Paul dominating the Ames straw poll, we got ourselves a race.
We have a top tier. It is Mitt Romney, Rick Perry, and Michelle Bachmann.
We have a new top tier, and it's Perry, Mitt Romney, and Bachmann.
There's now a top tier in this race, at least for now, of Romney, Perry, and Bachmann.
I mean, I think that's fair to say. Really fair to say? You're not forgetting, I don't know, anyone, say an ideologically consistent 12-term congressman who came within less than 200 votes of winning the straw poll? Isn't anyone going to give that gentleman a little love?
There's a top tier now of Bachmann and Perry and Romney, and, you know, we haven't mentioned, and we should.
Thank you.
We haven't mentioned, and we should, Rick Santorum, who did really surprisingly well for the amount of money and resources he had.
Rick Santorum? He didn't get half of what Ron Paul got. He lost to the guy who lost so bad he dropped out of the race. Santorum?
We're looking at Mitt Romney, who continues to be the front runner, but we have Rick Perry as well, and now Michelle Bachmann. Let's not count out John Huntsman, though.
What? John Huntsman? Huntsman got 69 votes. If all of John Huntsman's supporters met at the same Ames, Iowa Quiznos, the fire marshal would say, yeah, that's fine, no problem. There's still some tables open in the back. Huntsman was the only Mormon running in the straw poll, and he came in second amongst Mormons. And by the way, this pretending Ron Paul doesn't exist for some reason has been going on for weeks.
A new Gallup survey showing Rick Perry running second to Mitt Romney, knocking down Iowa favorite Michelle Bachmann to fourth.
Behind who? Fourth behind who? How did Libertarian Ron Paul become the 13th floor in a hotel? What's wrong with, he is Tea Party patient zero. All that small government grassroots business, he planted that grass. These other folks, they're just moral majorities in a tri-cornered hat. Ron Paul's the real deal, and Fox News should love this guy. But watch the disconnect between the debate moderators at Fox's Thursday debate and the debate audience.
Iran does not have an air force that can come here, just like we did in Iraq. Build up the war propaganda. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and they had nuclear weapons, and we had to go in. I'm sure you supported that war as well. Yeah. Okay. It's time we quit this. It's time. It's trillions of dollars we're spending on these wars.
What's with the smirk and the eye roll? The crowd goes nuts and you do one of these. There goes crazy Uncle Ron, babbling about the unsustainability of multiple wars. He's the one guy in the field, agree with him or don't agree with him, who doesn't go out of his way to regurgitate talking points or change what he believes to fit the audience he's in front of. And you're treating him like if this were Celebrity Apprentice, he'd be this guy. By the way, at the Ames, Iowa straw poll, Busey beat Huntsman 77-69. And even when the media does remember Ron Paul, it's only to reassure themselves how there's no need to remember Ron Paul.
Right now, live, right next to the bus behind us, Ron Paul is speaking. And 7 of the candidates are here today. We have live pictures of Ron Paul, but you know what? We're talking about Sarah Palin, we're talking about Rick Perry, the two people not in the race yet, Drew.
And guess what, Paul? If you get video of Sarah Palin or get a soundbite from her, bring that back to us. You can hold the Ron Paul stuff.
What's next? I'll tell you what's next. Ron Paul. Ron Paul. I'm not a big fan of Jon Stewart, but I love the fact that Jon Stewart finally shined a light on Ron Paul. The media doesn't want to talk about this guy. Ron Paul is the only presidential candidate who's actually going to get our troops out of the Middle East. He's the only presidential candidate who's going to bring our troops home, put them on our borders, and secure this country. Ron Paul's the only guy who's going to stop sending money to the Middle East in the forms of bribes. Ron Paul's the only guy who's going to fix the economy and create jobs in this country. Ron Paul's the only guy who hasn't flip-flopped on every issue in the last 30 years. Ron Paul's the only guy who speaks from the heart instead of from a teleprompter or a bunch of talking points written on a piece of paper. Why doesn't the media want to talk about Ron Paul? I'll tell you why. Because he doesn't have a fancy haircut and a slick suit. This country is more concerned with packaging than it is with substance. Ron Paul is a magna cum laude candidate in a community college world. Ron Paul is Happy Days when all we want to watch is the Jersey Shore. Ron Paul is Superman and we keep electing Hong Kong Phooey and Captain Caveman. Don't you get it? I mean, the media doesn't want to talk about Ron Paul. Democrats and Republicans both want you to believe this guy is not a viable candidate. Why? Because Ron Paul's the only person who's going to look out for you. All these other candidates are looking out for themselves and their freaking party. I mean, Ron Paul's not supported by the media. He's not supported by the Democrats. He's not supported by the Republicans. That tells me he's doing something right.
He's not considered a presidential frontrunner, but Ron Paul's raised tens of millions of dollars from a devoted base, many of them young people who love his libertarian straight talk.
The role, of course, is to return this country to sanity.
But how's this for straight talk? June 1992, right after the LA riots. In a copy obtained by CNN of the Ron Paul Political Report, one of several newsletters published in his name during the 1980s and 90s, quote, order was only restored in LA when it came time for the blacks to pick up their welfare checks. Another excerpt. The criminals who terrorize our cities, in riots and on every non-riot day, are not exclusively young black males, but they largely are. As children, they are trained to hate whites, to believe that white oppression is responsible for all black ills, to fight the power, to steal and loot as much money from the white enemy as possible. None of the articles we found say who wrote them. Ron Paul's spokesman says those words, published between Paul's 2 stints as a U.S. congressman from Texas, were not written by Paul, and he finds them abhorrent. Not good enough for one political veteran.
These stories may be very old in Ron Paul's life, but they're very new to the American public, and they deserve to be totally ventilated. I must say, I don't think it's an excuse in politics to have somebody go out under your name and say, oh, by the way, I didn't write that.
In some excerpts, the reader may be led to believe the words are Ron Paul's. In the Ron Paul Political Report in October 1992, the writer describes carjacking as the hip-hop thing to do among the urban youth who play unsuspecting whites like pianos. writes about advice from others on how to avoid carjacking. Then, I frankly don't know what to make of such advice, but even in my little town of Lake Jackson, Texas, I've urged everyone in my family to know how to use a gun in self-defense, for the animals are coming. Paul's spokesman says Paul has lived in Lake Jackson for years, but says Paul never wrote that, is saddened that someone took advantage of him, and points to Paul's statement saying, "I have publicly taken moral responsibility for not paying closer attention to what went out under my name." We spoke to the editor of Reason, a libertarian magazine which shares some of Paul's beliefs on big government. He says he's never heard Paul speak like that, but
what he has not done, and what I think some people are looking for him to do, is to say, okay, who wrote what? I mean, there's 20 years, give or take, worth of newsletters there.
Newsletters that rant against Martin Luther King, the Israeli lobby, gays, and AIDS victims. Many of them were reported this week by the New Republic magazine. There's one newsletter addressing American militias, ranting against the federal government, saying if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. That's from January 1995, just as Ron Paul was getting set to take office in his second stint in Congress. Paul's spokesman says the candidate doesn't know who wrote any of them. When we asked if Mr. Paul would try to find out, the spokesman said, no. What's the point? This is 15 years old. It's time to move on. Brian Todd, CNN, Washington.
And Republican presidential candidate Ron Paul is joining us now live from the campaign trail in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Congressman, thanks very much for coming in.
Thank you.
All right, let's talk about it. How could this happen? Because I've gone through some of these old Ron Paul newsletters, and it's got your name bannered on the top, and some of these comments, as we just heard from Brian's piece, are pretty shocking.
Yeah, it is, and of course it's been rehashed a long time, and it's coming up now for political reasons. But everybody knows in my district that I didn't write them, and I don't speak like that, and nobody has heard me ever say anything like that. And I've been reelected time and time again, so everybody knows that I don't participate in that type of language. But the point is when you bring this question up, you're really saying you're a racist, or are you a racist? And the answer is no, I'm not a racist. Matter of fact, Rosa Parks is one of my heroes. Martin Luther King is a hero because they practice the libertarian principle of civil disobedience, nonviolence. Libertarians are incapable of being a racist because racism is a collectivist idea. You see people in groups. A civil libertarian like myself see everybody as an important individual. It's not the color of their skin that is important, as Martin Luther King said. What is important is the character of the individual. You know what is really interesting, though, and this might be behind this, because I, as a Republican candidate, probably am getting the most number of black votes and black supporters, and now that has to be undermined. And I do this because I attack two wars that blacks are suffering from. One, the war overseas. In all wars, minorities suffer the most. So they join me in this position I have against the war in Iraq. And what about the war on drugs? What other candidate will stand up and fight in the can and say, I would pardon all blacks, all whites, everybody who are convicted for nonviolent drug acts and drug crimes? And this is where the real discrimination is. Let me finish this because I got to get my message back, because you put the other message out. Now, if you want to look for discrimination, it's in the judicial system. 14% of the inner city blacks commit drug crime. 67% of blacks are in prison. That's discrimination. That's the judicial code that I am attacking, and that is not racism. What I defend is the principle of libertarianism, where we never see people who belong to a group, and every individual is defended and protected because they're important in the individual, not because of their color of skin, but of their character. So I am the anti-racist because I am the only candidate, Republican or Democrat, who would protect the minority against these vicious drug laws.
Congressman, there's a lot of material there, but let me just try to figure out, how did this stuff get in these Ron Paul newsletters? Who wrote it?
Well, I have no idea. Have you ever heard of a publisher of a magazine not knowing every single thing? The editor is responsible for the daily activities, and people came and go, and there were some people that were hired. I don't know any of their names. I do not, absolutely honestly, do not know who wrote those things. But I do know there was a transition, there were changes around, and to me, it's been rehashed. This is the politics of it all. If it were important enough, why didn't the people in my district who have heard this for these 10 years or so, it came up and people believe me? why don't you believe me and just say, look, it's in there, it's bad, I recognize that, I had a moral responsibility, but that doesn't mean that you can, you know, indirectly charge me as being a racist, and that is what is being done, and yet I am the most anti-racist because I don't see people in collective groups, and I practice, and you know, right now, even before this thing broke, guess when our next fundraising day, our next super day? We raised $4 million one day, 6 on the next one's on Martin Luther King holiday. I mean, this is it. Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Gandhi, they're the heroes of mine in practice of civil disobedience to try to get the burden of government off our backs, and that's why I'm the one that protects the individual blacks who are in the city who are so unfairly being treated and thrown in prison. That's the message that needs to be heard, and I'd appreciate somebody helping bring that out rather than nitpicking over something done many years ago, which I did not write.
Did you used to read these newsletters, Congressman?
Not back then. There might have been at times I would, at times, but you know, I was in a medical practice. I traveled a lot. I was doing speeches around the country. So very frequently, you know, I never did see these. Matter of fact, some of the things you just read, I wouldn't have recognized them. And the point is, it's not part of my character. The point also is when people get charged, they usually have a clip. They never have a clip of somebody saying something, a slip of the tongue or something, and then they're blasted, the kingdom come. Nobody has ever heard me say that. They know those are not my thoughts, and therefore the people have not rejected me in Texas. And in a way, this is a bit of a witch hunt. I know there's reason. I don't say that you're unjustified in asking the question, but you also have to think of the motivation behind this. And maybe this is part of the anti-Ron Paul deal. You know, I got excluded from the debates the other night. And maybe this is part knockdown Ron Paul because he's gaining grounds with the blacks. I'm getting more votes right now and more support from the blacks because they understand what I'm talking about and they trust me.
I got to tell you, Congressman, you and I, we've talked a lot over these past several months. And when I saw these newsletters, I didn't know anything about them until I saw that article in the New Republic. I was pretty shocked because it certainly didn't sound like the Ron Paul that I've come to know and our viewers have come to know all this time. I just want to be clear because this is a chance for you to respond. You repudiate all of these racist comments, all of the slurs that are contained, even though it contains the name Ron Paul in these newsletters.
Well, the most important thing is anything I've ever said in my life has repudiated that for years and years and years. So I do repudiate everything that is written along those lines and what I heard tonight. And like I say, I've never read that before. If you asked me to dig up a copy of that, I wouldn't have the vaguest idea. That's how unimportant it was to me. But obviously it is important. It needs to be ironed out. In many ways, Wolf, I think I should thank you for bringing it about so I could clarify this and make sure everybody knew where I stood on this position, because it's obviously wrong. People who know me, nobody is going to believe this. Absolutely nobody. Just like you said, you've known me for a good many years and good many interviews, and that's just not my language. That's not my life. I mean, I honor and respect the civil rights movement and the civil disobedience, and right now, I really think that people have to think about the real discrimination in this country today has to do with the drug laws. And what other candidate would take it upon himself to challenge this whole system of the judiciary, which is so unfair to the minorities? Now, talk about that. That's what I want the people to hear. And out of fairness, that message needs to get out.
Ron Paul joining us from South Carolina. Thanks very much. You want to be president of the United States, you're going to have to expect a lot of scrutiny. All the candidates go through it. You're going through it right now yourself.
Let me ask you, the 64 Civil Rights Bill. The 64 Civil Rights Bill, do you think an employer, a guy who runs his shop down in Texas or anywhere, has the right to say, if you're black, you don't come in my store?
Well,
that was the libertarian right before 64. It was the better society.
I believe that property rights should be protected. Your right to be on TV is protected by property rights because somebody owns that station. I can't walk into your station. So right of freedom of speech is protected by property property. The right of your church is protected by property. So people should honor and protect it. This gimmick, Chris, it's off the wall when you say, I'm for property rights and states' rights, therefore I'm a racist. I mean, that's just outlandish. Because wait, Chris, people who have, let's say that law was there and you could do that, who's going to do it? What idiot?
Everybody was in the South.
What idiot would do it?
I saw the white-only signs driving through the South in college. Of course they did it. You remember them doing it.
Yeah, but I also know that the Jim Crow laws were illegal, and we got rid of them under that same law, and that's all.
Right,
good.
well, you would have voted against that law.
Pardon me?
You would have voted against that law. You wouldn't have voted for the 64 Civil Rights Bill.
I wouldn't vote against getting rid of the Jim Crow laws.
But you would have voted for the... Oh, come on. Honestly, Congressman, you were not for the 64 Civil Rights Bill.
Because of the property rights element, not because he got rid of the Jim Crow law.
The guy who owns a bar says no blacks allowed, and you say that's fine.
No, Chris, you're demagoguing it now.
No,
you know
I'm asking
that
a question. What is the answer? What's your answer?
You know, segregation was created by government laws. Slavery was created by government laws. Segregation, let me go. The segregation in the military by government laws. So what we want to do as libertarians is repeal all those laws and honor and respect people with freedom of choice. But for you to imply that a property rights person is endorsing that stuff, you don't understand that there would be zero signs up today saying something like that, and if they did, they would be an idiot and they would be out of business. So I think you're just getting overboard in order to try to turn it around and try to accuse somebody being a racist.
I'm not calling anybody racist. I'm saying the laws are racist.
That's what you're implying.
Let me ask you this. I once knew a laundromat when I was at the Peace Corps training in Louisiana, in Baker, Louisiana. A laundromat had this sign on in glaze, whites only on the laundromat, just to use the laundromat machines. This was a local shop saying no blacks allowed. You say that should be legal.
That's ancient history. That's ancient history. That's over and done with.
Because
and it was promoted by the segregation on buses and all was done by laws. So it was a culture. That's over and done with, Chris. Why do you want to go back to ancient days?
Because you want to come back.
It's past.
You're running for
president.
Because you're running for president as a libertarian. Believe we don't need laws to protect people.
And you're reading much more into it, and you're trying to imply certain beliefs that I don't have.
I think you're libertarian.
You're wrong. I think you're
a total libertarian.
You're doing it deliberately.
I think you're a total libertarian. I think that's what's appealing about you, sir. I think people like you.
Listen,
you know why they like you? They want to live in a simpler society.
Total libertarian is believing in liberty versus being a totalitarian. So if you want the opposite, just look around. That's what we have. We have a totalitarian world. That's what most of history's been about. Totalitarianism, dictatorship. We've only had a small taste of freedom of choice and the principle of private property and contract rights, and we're blowing it. So this whole thing that we're going to give up on that. What we're doing is trying to emphasize that something good and wonderful comes from freedom and freedom of choice, and that we should not say this, that liberty is disgusting, as you imply, and totalitarian should be the way we run our country.
Questions.
I think that's absurd.
Let's get to the Civil Rights Act. On the 40th anniversary of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, you said this on the floor of the House. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not improve race relations or enhance freedom. Now, you were not subject to segregation before the 1964 Civil Rights Act, so is it possible that you don't know or you don't understand that the removal of segregation was in fact an enhancement of freedom for African Americans who were not allowed to drink from the same drinking fountain as you were, who were not allowed to patronize certain restaurants, who were not allowed to do all sorts of things? Their freedom was very sharply restricted by law until that law. So how can you say that it did not enhance freedom?
Well, what I have said is certain portions of that bill were unconstitutional. But getting rid of the laws in the states that were blatantly unconstitutional, I mean, and were illegal, they should have been repealed. There's nothing wrong with repealing these things, but to take over private property is a different thing. Taking over private property to tell people what to do with their private property is like taking over the bedrooms and saying what you're going to do in the bedroom.
You mean
so
restaurants, right? You mean those dining
I'm talking about private property. I am talking about all private property. Wait.
You mean those dining counters that black people tried to integrate? You think those should not have been integrated because that's private property?
No, listen, Lawrence, listen to me, because those were all the laws that were written. Martin Luther King,
did it enhance freedom to get rid of those laws? Did it enhance freedom to get rid of those laws?
No, look, you're grossly misrepresenting what I'm saying.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not improve race relations or enhance freedom. The words of Ron Paul, word for word, you said that.
Well, if you understood exactly what the freedom philosophy does, it brings people together. Martin Luther King did not advocate some of the things that go on today. What he advocated was treating everybody equally and get rid of the laws. See, he practiced a libertarian principle by saying that, by practicing civil disobedience. That is great. Nullification of the laws, civil disobedience, in order to repeal the laws. Segregation in this country has always been the government. Just think of the military, the army, the slavery. It's only the libertarian principles of treating everybody as an individuals. So slavery on up to the military, guess where the first real integration occurred? Voluntarily in sports. So the portions of the law in 1964 that were bad because they violated property rights, I object to that because it violates the property rights of people who want to have privacy in their bedroom. And that private, economic and personal liberty are all in the same. So when you understand that, you understand. See, Barry Goldwater was opposed to that, and he wasn't, he wasn't considered an evil person. Back then, Chris Matthews was a supporter of Barry Goldwater on his position. So to demagogue this and pick this up, I think you're really desperate.
Congressman, let's not try to pretend that libertarianism is what changed segregation in this country. It was activist, liberal government that changed segregation. Otherwise, it would still be with us. It took activist, liberal Washington government in the Civil Rights Act to end that segregation that you properly decry. All right, sure. We're going to go out on that agreement.
We want to repeal. We want to repeal. All you need to do is repeal the Jim Crow laws. All we say is that you repeal the bad laws and you treat people equally under the law. That is what you do. And unfortunately today, everything is done by group rights. Individuals have rights. You don't have rights because you belong to a group. Property rights are identical to personal liberty and social liberties. And you have property rights. Your right to be on TV is a property rights because people can't march in to your station and have prior restraint. And that is exactly what all property. You can't pick and choose on your property and say, oh, you can have private property rights and freedom in your church, but not in your store, your house, and whatnot. So it is a poor understanding that brings us to this. So I should say that it is the libertarian that understands this, and Martin Luther King understood this, and he used libertarian principles by practicing peaceful civil disobedience and also repealing laws. Here, in the early part of the program, you condemn me for wanting to repeal laws. Well, I'm the one that wants to repeal the Jim Crow laws. That's what we wanted to do. That's what a libertarian wants. So you don't understand that, and that's okay, but others have.
You're too human to be a Republican. Now, I was on Bill Maher about a year and a half ago or so, and you came on, and you came on by satellite, and you were explaining about the Civil War, how it didn't need to be fought. And I was at first like, he's saying that it didn't need to be fought. But when you explained it to me, I thought it was one of the most pragmatic, reasonable things I've ever heard a politician say.
Well, the other nations in the West that had slavery all got rid of slavery without a civil war. And the motivation behind the Civil War had more to do than just the slavery issue. So we lost 600,000 Americans and a lot of residual, probably some left over today. There's still residual. So you could have, with a small fraction of the money and no deaths, just bought the slaves, you know, and freed the slaves. That's what Britain did in some other nations, and that just makes a lot more sense than fighting war and killing each other.
I tell you
I
what,
don't like this war as a solution to our problems.
you make way too much sense. You can't be a Republican. I say it again. Are you going to run again in 2012?
Well, I might be running from somebody or running for Congress or who knows what.
Thank you, Congressman Ron Paul. It was a pleasure.
You're from Texas and running against a governor who I believe has signed more death warrants than anyone in American history. So it makes me wonder, where do you stand on the death penalty, and can you trust government to administer that?
Yeah, that's a pretty good question. Because somebody asked me yesterday, when was the last time you ever changed your opinion? And I said, well, it's been a while since I've had a major change of opinion, but I try to understand and study and figure out how things work, you know, become better at economics and all. But on that issue, I did have a change of opinion. And I stated this in the debates last go around. They asked a similar question: when did you change your opinion last? And that was just not like overnight. But my position now is since I'm a federal official, I'm not be a U.S. president, I do not believe in the federal death penalty. And in my book, Liberty Defined, I explain it in more detail. But basically, I make the argument for against the death penalty. But I would not come and say that the federal government, the federal courts, to tell the states that they can't have a death penalty anymore. I don't go that far. But no, I just don't think the scientific evidence now they show. I think I read an article yesterday on the death penalty, and 68% of the time they make mistakes, and it's so racist too. I think more than half the people getting the death penalty are poor blacks. This is the one place, the one remnant of racism in our country is in our court system, enforcing the drug laws, enforcing the death penalty. I don't even know, but I wonder how many how many have been executed? Over 200. That's
over 200. I
wonder how many were minorities. You know, if you're rich, you usually don't meet the death penalty. So that reason, and the DNA evidence now has proven people innocent over a period of time. All this stuff just built up. Why waste the time? You know, all this, and I don't think it's a very. It's not a good sign for civilization to still be invoking the death penalty. But so nationally, I would not endorse the death penalty, and state-wise, I wouldn't interfere with it.
Thank you so
much. But I'd argue the moral case against it.
Even though a majority of individuals who have served as president since Abraham Lincoln have been Republican, I believe that most black Americans who will vote in the year 2008 are not able to name even one Republican president in the 142 years since Lincoln's death who have left a positive and significant legacy for black Americans. If you are elected president in 2008, what positive and significant legacy, if any, will you leave for black Americans?
Paul? I would like to believe that if we have a freer society, it will take care of blacks and whites and everybody equally, because we're all individuals, and to me that is so important. But if we had equal justice under the law, I think it would be a big improvement. If we had probably a repeal of most of the federal laws on drugs and the unfairness on how blacks are treated with these drug laws, it would be a tremendous improvement. And also, I think that if you're going to have prosperity, it serves everybody. And if this is done by emphasizing property rights and freedom of the individuals, making sure that the powerful special interests don't control Washington, that the military-industrial complex doesn't suck away all the wealth of the country, and then we will have prosperity. This is what we need, and we need to share it. The free society is the only society that can provide goods and services and distribute them in the most fair manner. And that is the society that I would advocate and argue for and believe it's available to us.
Governor, I want to ask about race and unemployment. In 2006, the unemployment rate of black high school graduates, that's high school graduates, was 33% higher than the unemployment rate for white high school dropouts. What do you think accounts for that inequity?
Paul? Walter Williams, a very astute free market economist, has studied this extensively. And he has found that prior to minimum wage laws, there was no discrepancy like this. So he put a lot of blame on the minimum wage law. Once government gets interfering, this takes away opportunities. And I believe there is a lot of truth to this because it eliminates an opportunity and a chance for a marginal worker. So once again, though, the economy is supported only when you have a sound economy perpetuated by government with sound policies. You have to have sound money, you have to have minimum taxes, you have to have wise foreign policy. But I have a bill in that might help a lot of people, black or white or whomever. I have a bill in that would immediately help these people who are trying to get a start, that they would never have to pay any taxes or payroll taxes if they just happen to be a waiter or waitress, to give them a chance to get ahead and get a good job.
Thank you. I'm back. Tonight, as young black and Latino Americans are watching this debate, they often feel quite alienated from the Republican Party, a party that does not seem to respond to their issues. You realize about 50% of young black and Latino people dropping out of high school, 35% poverty rate, nearly 60% of America's prison population, black and brown. The one area of these problems touching on federal government policy has to do with criminal justice. Today in Jena, Louisiana, it was announced that one of the Jena 6, originally convicted as an adult, will be tried now as a juvenile. Name one reform, Senator, that you would endorse to assure young black and Latino people in America that they will have equal justice in America's courts.
A system designed to protect individual liberty will have no punishments for any group and no privileges. Today, I think inner city folks and minorities are punished unfairly in the war on drugs. For instance, blacks make up 14% of those who use drugs, yet 36% of those arrested are blacks, and it ends up that 63% of those who finally end up in prison are blacks. This has to change. We don't have to have more courts and more prisons. We need to repeal the whole war on drugs. It isn't working. We have already spent over $400 billion since the early 70s, and it's a wasted money. Prohibition didn't work. Prohibition on drugs doesn't work. So we need to come to our senses, and absolutely, it's a disease. We don't treat alcoholics like this. This is a disease, and we should orient ourselves to this. That is one way you could have equal justice under the law.
Thank you, Congressman. So if you are not for immigration reform, if you do not agree with the idea that the children of undocumented immigrants should become automatically U.S. citizens, how are you going to get 35% of the Hispanic vote if you become the Republican candidate? I mean, it would be almost impossible, as you know. Most Hispanic voters don't agree with you.
For me to think that I have to have a different message for Hispanics than I do for other people, I think is unnecessary. I think that Hispanics have as much interested in freedom as everybody else. So to say that I have to kowtow in a sense of saying, well, the only way you can get a vote for any special group, is by giving special privileges. I don't want to punish anybody because they belong to a group, but nobody should get a special privilege either.
I want to say
I want to say African Americans or black people or whatever you want to call yourself, people of color in this country, don't be afraid. We cannot vote for people based on the color of their skin. We cannot vote for people based on their gender. We have to look at the truth. This war on drugs is killing our children, it's killing our families, it's killing our communities. This war on guns is killing our children, it's killing our families. There are too many nonviolent of our men sitting in prison. There are too many black women without husbands because young black boys are struggling in school. We need the education system turned back over to the states, and we need to get rid of these federal crimes so we can build our families back and love each other and take care of each other. Don't be afraid. Take a stand. Believe in the truth. If Ron Paul wasn't in this race, with more study, see, I just found out they said that Barack Obama was going to send 100,000 more troops. So he said that, I think, in March. So, and I'm really against the war. I have a 12-year-old son who's brilliant. I come from a family of veterans, so I don't have a problem with people fighting for their country, but we need to fight in just wars. So I can't say, because nobody matches Ron Paul. Nobody tells the truth as far as they know it. Well, yeah, I don't want to call them liars, but we're going to be tasteful here. But freedom is popular. I became a Ron Paul supporter in June, actually, and I started a meetup group. And we've just been sending out emails to our friends and telling them about the meetup and telling them how this man brings together people of all races, all socioeconomic backgrounds, all political affiliations, because freedom is truth and truth is power, and we can live and be free in this country if we believe we can.
What up, world? This video is in reference to all of these unfounded statements about Ron Paul being racist based off of him saying he wouldn't have voted for the Civil Rights Act. Now, first of all, I want you guys to recognize the political games played throughout the mainstream media, you know what I mean? Now, the term racism gets thrown around like monkeys throwing shit at a zoo, you know what I mean? Like, it bothers me, you know what I mean? It bothers me that newscasters will go on national TV and just label somebody racist without ever actually investigating the racist claims, you know what I mean? And regardless if a candidate is even racist or not, the fact that they've been labeled as racist, once it's out there, you know what I mean? And people run with it. You got the internet that's just filled with a bunch of repeaters, you know what I mean? And me as a black guy, I'm supporting Ron Paul for 2012, you know what I mean? He has the best ideas, he has the best grasp on what the American tradition was initially set out to be, that being a free and just society, you know what I mean, whose main goal was to promote liberty, you know what I mean? And through us ensuring that our citizens are guaranteed the liberties and the rights that have been listed in our Constitution, not granted by our Constitution, but listed within the Constitution. To me, that's the only real way you can properly spread our way of life throughout the world, by setting an example, not through the barrel of a gun. Which leads me to Ron Paul's ideas on foreign policy and stuff like that. I think he has the most sensible approach to how we should be dealing with other nations, you know what I mean? We shouldn't be pressuring people of different faiths, different creeds to succumb to what we do, you know what I mean, through force and stuff like that. The best way to do it is to set the example and do it the right way at home, you know what I mean? How can we promote democracy and freedom and rights abroad when we're constantly being stripped daily through legislation like the Patriot Act, internet censorship and shit like that, you know what I mean? But back to the Ron Paul and the Civil Rights Act, you know what I mean? Pretty much because I've been reading a lot of articles today about Ron Paul being racist because he wouldn't have voted for the Civil Rights Act. And most people, it's like their thought process doesn't go through the full in-depth analysis of the statement, you know what I mean? It's easy to read a headline that says Ron Paul wouldn't have voted for the Civil Rights Act and then initially just label him as racist, you know what I mean? But the reasons behind him not voting for the Civil Rights Act, the civil rights legislation, as it was written, was because not for any racial beliefs or anything like that. Like Ron Paul does not believe black people are less human than white people. I can guarantee you that. You know what I mean? He promotes freedom and liberty for all people. You know what I mean? He has the most common sense understanding for the prison industrial complex and how it's set up in a way to basically entrap mostly minorities. You know what I mean? And the drug laws and the drug policy, and how basically our war on drugs, like the first law against any kind of drug, making it illegal, was based off of racial tensions and racial propaganda, you know what I mean? Like going back to marijuana and shit like that. The reason why they outlawed that initially was because of its diverse application, you know what I mean? Like you can make anything from marijuana. They made, Henry Ford made a car that ran off of hemp seed oil, and it was actually built from hemp, and it was damn near indestructible, you know what I mean? But, so Ron Paul's stance on the Civil Rights Act, the only problem that he had with it, it was a problem of principle, which is what I see being his strongest characteristic, but it also hurts him in such a way, you know what I mean? Because his interviews on TV, like it's very limited, you know what I mean? His time to respond to certain questions, and the way they frame these questions, it's to get a certain type of response from the person who's being interviewed, you know what I mean? But when it comes down to it, his biggest beef with the Civil Rights Act was that it was a federal mandate telling business owners basically how to run their businesses, you know what I mean? But the way I can see it being spun in the media, it's so disingenuous and it's so unhonest, you know what I mean? It's I mean, looking at a newscaster, you know what I mean? If this is your job, the equivalent to labeling Ron Paul a racist is like, it's like gross negligence and it's malfeasance. It's like common sense isn't even applied to the debate or the conversation, you know what I mean? Like his problem with it is more so when it comes down to property rights, you know what I mean? And property rights meaning that anybody who decides to open up a business in a free market should be the end all and be all of who it is or how their business would be run, you know what I mean? Now, as far as going back to the 60s and the Civil Rights Act and all that stuff about how there was a bunch of businesses in the South about where whites only, they didn't serve black people weren't allowed to go into those establishments and stuff like that, you know what I mean? We can all look back on that and say that, yo, that's wrong, you know what I mean? Like, who the hell are you? You know what I mean? Like, we can all look back at that time in our history and we can say that that society that was in place at the time is what basically set the standard, you know what I mean, for that moment in time as to where racism was okay and this and that. But since then, there's been a huge paradigm shift, and I totally agree with Ron Paul on well, not agree, but like I'm not offended at all by the fact that he wouldn't have voted for the Civil Rights Act based off of property rights issue, you know what I mean? Because if we looked at businesses today, right, and if we just said, you know what I mean, like, yo, you can serve whoever you want. If you want a whites only coffee shop, it's up to you. Go ahead, go for it. You know why? Because the paradigm shift since the 60s has been so drastic that we can all now look at each other with a certain level of respect, you know what I mean? And we can say, some of my best friends are white, you know what I mean? And we can all basically honestly look at each other and say, yeah, we're all equal people here, you know what I mean? And in a free market, if someone would be dumb enough to close off a large portion of the country, you know what I mean, based off of a racial issue, I mean, based off of a free market principle, they would put themselves out of business because there would be a coffee shop down the street who would serve blacks and whites, and they would get twice as much revenue, you know what I mean? Anybody who would be dumb enough to run a business based off of racial segregation, you know what I mean, in today's society, they would go out of business, you know what I mean? But a lot of that has to do with the marchings of Martin Luther King and all that stuff, and just the philosophical change that happened throughout the country at the time, you know what I mean? So my advice to a lot of the people out there, when it comes to these news articles who are trying to slander Ron Paul's name based off of racial issues and stuff like that, don't even pay it any attention, because any good debater can look at personal attacks as the first sign of a failing argument, you know what I mean? So they'd rather promote Ron Paul the racist so that he wouldn't get your vote, you know what I mean? And they can push some other fucking neocon or fucking another Obama on you, you know what I mean? But the fact is, there is no message stronger throughout man's history that can bring people together, no matter what color, what creed, what religion, than freedom and liberty. You know what I mean? And if you're gonna buy into the racial wedge issues that the likes of MSNBC, like I was watching Chris Matthews' interview today, and Ron Paul pretty much owned his ass. You know what I mean? Like, he was basically trying to frame the debate, frame the argument in such a way to where he can portray Ron Paul as being a racist. You know what I mean? And the fact of the matter is, dude, Ron Paul is more pro-black Americans than President Obama. You know what I mean? Like, on some real shit, because Obama's still willing to lock your black ass up if you get caught smoking a J. You know what I mean? Like, Ron Paul's like, look, I have no business telling you how to live your life within your home. You know what I mean? And if you look at that argument, the whole drug war argument, there's nobody making any more sense than Ron Paul, because in today's society, it's okay if we want to stay in our house, have a beer, smoke a cigarette, you know what I mean? It's all right, you know what I mean? But if we were to go outside the door, publicly intoxicated and start a fight, you know what I mean? Yeah, that's illegal, you know what I mean? That's the proper way to regulate it, you know what I mean? And the alcohol business is a lucrative business, you know what I mean? There's a lot of money being made off of that, you know what I mean? And despite the fact that alcohol kills more people than pretty much any other illegal drug, you know what I mean? It's almost ridiculous, you know what I mean? So, I mean, just, you know what I mean? So, I mean, just to clear it up, or clarify my position on Ron Paul and all these false accusations that he's a racist, I mean, to me, it's such an elementary argument, you know what I mean? Like, if people would really believe that if Ron Paul was elected president, you know what I mean, like, he'd be promoting the KKK and all this and that, you know what I mean? Like Ron Paul's promoting drug legalization, but he doesn't do drugs, you know what I mean? Like, he's just saying, like, this isn't the proper way to handle the issue, you know what I mean? Like, they're talking about eradicating drug use to 100% levels, you know what I mean? And they've been talking about that for the last 70 fucking years, you know what I mean? And these niggas is losing, you know what I'm saying? So the fact is, don't get caught up in the hype, man, because I'm telling you, over the next couple of months, there's gonna be a lot of false labeling that's gonna be issued on both sides of the aisle, you know what I mean? So it's basically, it comes down to us as a people willing to do our own research, because I'm telling you, you can't trust these clowns on TV, man. These motherfuckers, MSNBC, CNN, they're pretty much pro-democratic organizations and this and that, you know what I mean? But it's because they're mostly funded from organizations of that ilk, you know what I mean? And then you got Fox News, who's pretty much pro-right-wing propaganda, you know what I mean? But it's because of who's funding them. These people wouldn't be endorsing these messages if they weren't getting paid to do it, you know what I mean? So you need to look beyond the mainstream media and their interpretation on what's good for you, you know what I mean? You need to go and do your own homework, do some research on their voting records, you know what I mean? Like, some interesting things you might find out about Ron Paul. He's never, ever voted for a tax increase, ever, in like over 20 plus years as a congressman, you know what I mean? Fucking Barack Obama pretty much ran his campaign on the fact that he wouldn't raise taxes under any circumstances, and within the first year he was in office, he raised taxes like 2 or 3 times or some shit like that, you know what I mean? He passed legislation for the healthcare, Obamacare shit, you know what I mean, which would be the largest tax on America in history, you know what I mean? So it comes down to when you look at it, you know what I mean? Whether, even if it's not just a racial issue, you know what I mean? Even when it comes down to religion and shit like that, we should really not even be getting caught up in, oh, well, I'm a Christian and I can't vote for somebody who's not a Christian, or I'm pro-Muslim, I don't want any Christians, or I'm an atheist and I don't think anybody who believes in any kind of religion should be running the country, you know what I mean? That's irrelevant, you know what I mean? You need to look at what we all have in common, you know what I mean? Because people would find, even Obama supporters would find that they have more in common with Ron Paul supporters than they do, or than they don't have in common, you know what I mean? Like, the fact is, we're all people, right? You know what I mean? We all have rights endowed to us from our Creator, or if you're an atheist, I would say the principle, you know what I mean? principle in the sense that if you don't subscribe to believing in a higher power and stuff like that, the fact is we're here and we exist. You know what I mean? And our rights are enshrined in our existence, regardless if it happened from an accidental Big Bang that kicked off billions and billions of years ago. You know what I mean? Or if you subscribe to a religion of some sort. You know what I mean? You believe in a higher power or whatever. You know what I mean? The fact is we need to stop all this bullshit racial labeling shit, man, because I'm telling you, they're slandering this guy's name and running it through the mud because they are truly afraid that he's going to unleash the potential of the American people. The fact is we need to stop all this bullshit racial labeling shit. The fact is we need to stop all this bullshit racial labeling shit.
Well, what is the answer? What's your answer?
You know, segregation was created by government laws. Slavery was created by government laws. Segregation, let me go. The segregation in the military by government laws. So what we want to do as libertarians is repeal all those laws and honor and respect people with freedom of choice.
Well, what is the answer? What's your answer?
You know, segregation was created by government laws. Slavery was created by government laws. Segregation, let me go. The segregation in the military by government laws. So what we want to do as libertarians is repeal all those laws and honor and respect people with freedom of choice.
Is it time to end Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy and allow gays and lesbians to serve openly in the U.S. military?
I think the current policy is a decent policy. And the problem that we have with dealing with this subject is we see people as groups, as they belong to certain groups, and that they derive their rights as belonging to groups. We don't get our rights because we're gays or women or minorities. We get our rights from our Creator as individuals. So every individual should be treated the same way. So if there's homosexual behavior in the military that is disruptive, it should be dealt with. But if there's heterosexual sexual behavior that is disruptive, it should be dealt with. So it isn't the issue of homosexuality, it's the concept and the understanding of individual rights. If we understood that, we would not be dealing with this very important problem.
Unfortunately, today, everything is done by group rights. Individuals have rights. You don't have rights because you belong to a group.
All right, let me ask you another question. The Obama administration is in the process, and Leon Panetta, as the new defense secretary, will implement essentially the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So gays will be allowed to serve openly in the military. I want to ask each of you, and again, if we can be quickly, because then we want to get to the voters' questions. If you become president of the United States, now gays are allowed to serve openly in the military. Would you leave that policy in place, or would you try to change it? Go back to Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or something else?
I would not work to overthrow it, but we have to remember rights don't come in groups. We shouldn't have gay rights. Rights come as individuals, and we wouldn't have this major debate going on. It would be behavior that would count, not the person who belongs to which group.
Even though a majority of individuals who have served as president since Abraham Lincoln have been Republican, I believe that most black Americans who will vote in the year 2008 are not able to name even one Republican president in the 142 years since Lincoln's death who have left a positive and significant legacy for black Americans. If you are elected president in 2008, what positive and significant legacy, if any, will you leave for black Americans?
Paul? I would like to believe that if we have a freer society, it will take care of blacks and whites and everybody equally, because we're all individuals, and to me that is so important. But if we had equal justice under the law, I think it would be a big improvement. If we had probably a repeal of most of the federal laws on drugs and the unfairness on how blacks are treated with these drug laws, it would be a tremendous improvement. And also, I think that if you're going to have prosperity, it serves everybody. And if this is done by emphasizing property rights and freedom of the individuals, making sure that the powerful special interests don't control Washington, that the military-industrial complex doesn't suck away all the wealth of the country, and then we will have prosperity. This is what we need, and we need to share it. The free society is the only society that can provide goods and services and distribute them in the most fair manner. And that is the society that I would advocate and argue for and believe it's available to us.
Congressman, so if you are not for immigration reform, if you do not agree with the idea that the children of undocumented immigrants should become automatically U.S. citizens, how are you going to get 35% of the Hispanic vote if you become the Republican candidate? I mean, it would be almost impossible. As you know, most Hispanic voters don't agree with you.
For me to think that I have to have a different message for Hispanics than I do for other people, I think is unnecessary. I think that Hispanics have as much interested in freedom as everybody else. So to say that I have to kowtow in a sense of saying, well, the only way you can get a vote for any special group, is by giving special privileges. I don't want to punish anybody because they belong to a group, but nobody should get a special privilege either.
Hello, this is Congressman Ron Paul with your weekly update for March 8th. Last week, Congress voted to encourage participation in the 2010 census. I voted no on this resolution for the simple, obvious reason that the census, like so many government programs, has grown far beyond what the framers of our Constitution intended. The invasive nature of the current census raises questions about how and why government will use the collected information. It also demonstrates how the federal bureaucracy consistently encourages citizens to think of themselves in terms of groups rather than as individual Americans. The not-so-subtle implication is that each group, whether ethnic, religious, social, or geographic, should speak up and demand its fair share of federal largesse. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution calls for an enumeration of citizens every 10 years for the purpose of apportioning congressional seats among the various states. In other words, the census should be nothing more than a head count. It was never intended to serve as a vehicle for gathering personal information on citizens. But our voracious federal government thrives on collecting information. In fact, to prepare for the 2010 census, state employees recorded GPS coordinates for every front door in the United States so they could locate individuals with greater accuracy. Once duly located, individuals are asked detailed questions concerning their name, address, race, home ownership, and whether they periodically spend time in prison or at a nursing home, just to name a few examples. From a constitutional perspective, of course, the answer to each of these questions is none of your business. But the bigger question is why government is so intent on compiling this information in the first place. The Census Bureau claims that collected information is not shared with any federal agency, but rather is kept under lock and key for 72 years. It also claims that no information provided to census takers can be used against you by the government. However, these promises can and have been abused in the past. Census data was used to locate men who had not registered for the draft. Census data also was used to find Japanese Americans for internment camps during World War II. Furthermore, the IRS has applied census information to detect alleged tax evaders. Some local governments even have used census data to check for compliance with zoning regulations. It is not hard to imagine that information compiled by the census could be used against people in the future, despite claims to the contrary and the best intentions of those currently in charge of the Census Bureau. The government can and does change its mind about these things, and people have a right to be skeptical about government promises. If there are consequences for not submitting to the census and its intrusive questions, if the form is not mailed back in time, households will experience the pleasure of a visit by a government worker asking the questions in person. If the government still does not get the information it wants, it can issue a fine up to $5,000. If the federal government really wants to increase compliance with the census, it should abide by the Constitution and limit its inquiry to one simple question: how many people live here? Thanks for calling this update. A new update is placed on this number, 888-322-1414, every Monday. The written text can be found on my website, www.house.gov/Paul, under the heading.
The fact is, we need to stop all this bullshit racial labeling.
The American people are living in a matrix. They don't understand the truth of how things are working in this country. You know, And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. The very fact is that if you ask 100 people on the street, what kind of government is America supposed to be? 99% of them will tell you a democracy. America is supposed to be a democracy. But that's a lie. That's an illusion. The word democracy is not written into the Constitution at one time. It's not in the Bill of Rights. It's not in the Declaration of Independence. The Founding Fathers hated the idea of a democracy. They thought it was the worst form of government there is. And I agree with them. Because in a democracy, 51% of the people control 49% of the people. If you're part of the 49%, you're not free. America was founded as a constitutional republic. And in that constitutional republic that we have, 99% of the people can't take away the rights of 1%. You have your rights because you were born with them. You have God-given human rights that nobody can take away from you. The government, the majority, no matter who they are, I can't take away your rights. And that's what our founding fathers gave us. But the psychological operations that they do to us, they make us believe that we're a democracy and that majority rules, you see? And they want you to believe that. Because then they tell you this poll says this many want this and this many want that and this many want this, and it doesn't have anything to do with anything.
Well, Hitler was elected.
Hitler was elected. Hitler did everything legally.
And in a constitutional republic, a minority is protected against a majority. Wasn't it Benjamin Franklin, to paraphrase, that said democracy is two wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner?
Exactly. And then he also said, in a republic, the sheep would have a gun to protect himself. You know, and that's the truth. America's not a democracy, but you ask the most intelligent people what form of government America is supposed to be, they'll say democracy. Because that's what they've been brainwashed. They've been psyoped into believing that. They believe that we're in Iraq. They believe we're in Iraq to promote democracy. The word democracy, you hear George Bush saying democracy means freedom. No, democracy equals New World Order. Democracy equals slavery. The word democracy is not synonymous with freedom. It's the opposite of freedom. Democracy is the worst form of government you can have because it's majority rule. And the government can tell you exactly what they want to tell you to do because the majority wants it. I don't care what the majority wants. I live my life as I choose. And if I don't commit violence, theft, or fraud against another human being, I can live my life as I wish. That's my choice. And if I'm allowed to make mistakes, because when you make mistakes, you learn from them. You grow as a human being. We're put on this earth to become the best individuals we can be, to fulfill our God-given potential, right? We're not here to put on this earth so that the government can tell us how to live our lives and what we must do. We put into these systems and these paradigms. No. The same thing in health. You know, if you're sick, you have to have a certain protocol. Nonsense. You know, be individuals, think for yourself, have critical thinking.
One of the reasons why I'm supporting Congressman Ron Paul for president in 2012 is because he realizes the imperfections of democracy. Democracy does not equal freedom, nor does it equal liberty, and this is the mistake that neoconservatives often make when they try to justify the United States invading other countries on the grounds that we are spreading democracy. You're not going to hear this kind of propaganda from Ron Paul. Democracy opens up the gates for tyranny of the majority, and our representatives often succumb to the pressures from lobbyists, and they end up serving special interests instead of the interests of the American people like they're supposed to. The libertarian argument against democracy, as presented by Rothbard, also considers the fact that not all Americans vote, so to say that an elected official was picked by the majority simply because 51% of those individuals who voted were in favor of a certain candidate is completely false and misleading. Not to mention the fact that there is a lot of voter fraud that goes on in our allegedly democratic elections in the U.S. and abroad.
Democracy. Yeah, democracy is very dangerous because that's mob rule. If you get 51%, then your rights become relative. 51% come and vote and say, well, we can do anything we want. How do you protect them?
So you think democracy is dangerous?
Well, yes, it's dangerous because 51% rules. That's how the minority gets cheated. You always have to, in a free society, you have to protect the minority. But why should the 51% said slavery? I mean, that's horrible. So no, to protect the minority, you cannot say that the majority can dictate rights. that is very, very dangerous, and the founders are very, very clear on this. They said, we don't even want a democracy, we want a republic. And I mean, it is extensively written how dangerous they considered a democracy, that 51%, and de Tocqueville, pointed this out as well, that it would be the dictatorship of the majority. The majority, when they're wrong, are very dangerous.
You know that all the polls show that the majority, in some cases an overwhelming majority of the American people, want higher taxes on millionaires and billionaires, as the president likes to say. Why are the American people wrong when answering that question?
Well, because pure democracy sometimes leads to these ill-advised positions. When there's a war propaganda going on and they beat the war drums and everybody says 75% of people want us to go to war, and then after 10 years they're sick and tired of it, doesn't mean it was right when 75% said something. This is the danger of pure democracy, when you demagogue and you attack somebody and say that we have to attack the wealthy. I don't mind criticizing, the wealthy at times, and I criticize the bankers and the bailouts and the corporate people who got all the benefits, both when the financial bubble was being built, but then when it burst, they got bailed out, and then the people suffered. But this doesn't mean that we should attack wealth for the sake of wealth. We should stop all the subsidies to the wealth. Anybody's getting wealthy because they get contracts from the government, or because they're on the inside of the program where they get the bailouts. That's quite a bit different. We should stop that, but not blanketly penalize people who make wealth and who have created wealth and provided great services for the consumer.
What I'm asking for is, how are you going to turn this country around? Paul.
If you care about your children, you'll get the federal government out of the business of educating our kids. In 1980, when the Republican Party ran, part of the platform was to get rid of the Department of Education. By the year 2000, it was eliminated, and we fed on to it. Then we, as Republicans, added No Child Left Behind. So the first thing a president should do is the goal should be set to get the government out completely, but don't enforce this law of No Child Left Behind. It's not going to do any good, and nobody likes it. And there's no value to it. The teachers don't like it, and the students don't like it. But there are other things that the federal government can do, and that is give tax credits for the people who will opt out. We ought to have a right to opt out of the public system if you want.
This is Department of Education, one of the big, beautiful buildings in Washington. You'd get rid of it? We don't need this?
Yes, just think of what kind of businessman might be able to make good use of that piece of property.
But
no,
how
we
do
don't
people
need
get
it.
educated?
We might get better education. The evidence shows since the 1950s, since the federal government's gotten involved, the quality of education has gone down and the cost has gone up. So
federal government should have no role?
There's no authority for it, and they've proved themselves inefficient. The one city they're totally in charge of is Washington, D.C., $13,000 a year per student. They have more guns, more drugs, more violence. A bad educational system. So there's no evidence that the government can do a very good job.
Congressman Paul, what's the biggest obstacle standing in the way of improving education in the United States, and how would you address it?
Probably the federal government. We've been involved at the federal level for over 50 years. We've had a Department of Education. It used to be the policy of the Republican Party to get rid of the Department of Education. We finally get in charge and a chance to do something, so we doubled the size of the Department of Education, and we have No Child Left Behind. The teachers don't like it, the students don't like it, and the quality of education hasn't gone up. The cost of education has gone up. So we need to look to our local resources. We need to release the creative energy of the teachers at the local level, but what we can do immediately is to give tax credits. I have a bill that would give tax credits to the teachers to raise their salaries. At the same time, we should encourage homeschooling and private schooling and let the individuals write that off. The parents have to get control of the education. It used to be parents had control of education through local school boards. Today, it's the judicial system and the executive branch of government, the bureaucracy that controls things. And it would be predictable that the quality would go down. The money goes to the bureaucrats and not to the educational system at home.
In the district, in order to, present the case for the Constitution and limited government, it has been challenging. And one of the key group of people that have worked for me for so long over these many years have been the homeschoolers. They seem to understand the Constitution. I wonder why that is. Homeschoolers seem to understand the Constitution compared to those who have gone to public schools. So I'm highly critical of the public school system. I praise homeschoolers, but I have to admit I went through the public school system, and so did my children. But I always thought it was a struggle to relearn or get rid of those things that were put into my brain that I thought turned out to be incorrect. So in economic policy or the understanding of the Constitution. So that is why, I have a lot of optimism, and one of them has to do with the homeschoolers. And all I have to do is look around and see if there's a contest, a spelling bee or some other geography, and I'll say, oh, those homeschoolers are doing pretty good. I guess they're getting a pretty good education. And since I got to know so many homeschoolers in my district, one thing that I have learned that has been wholeheartedly refuted, they always say about people that homeschool their kids, the children will be withdrawn and not be personally sociable. And all I know is that first thing is when I would campaign, the homeschoolers, actually, they were allowed out of school to come to an event, such as a politician being in town. And lo and behold, I knew if there was a rally or something and somebody 8, 10, 12, or 14 stood up and asked a question, a very intelligent question, I didn't have to ask where they were getting their education. So the poise that they have and all, it's just been remarkable. But, it is reassuring to know this. And it's reassuring to know that we still have this freedom and this responsibility to our children, but we can't even take that for granted, because in the 1980s in Texas, homeschooling was severely challenged, and I believe the challenge will return if we are not careful. But today we are still fortunate. We can homeschool our kids, and we can have private schools. I would try to help them more, financially, not by grants, obviously, and not even by but what I would do is allow tax credits so people can get some of their own tax money back and not send it to the government if there are expenses involved, whether they're homeschooled or whether they are in private schools or whether they're extra tutoring, just so that we can get some of that money back in where the responsibility and the determination for education is by the parent. But But today, I believe we do face a constitutional crisis, and that's why we need to hurry up and raise up some more kids that know something about the Constitution before it's too late. But once again, though, I think that that group of individuals who are interested in the strict interpretation of the Constitution is much larger than we ever dreamed. And when I talk to the young people coming to me on the campuses, the ones who have learned about the campaign on the internet, the ones that may not have been homeschooled, I ask them constantly, what's bringing you into the campaign? And it varies a bit, but so often it said, I like your position on the Constitution. And that to me is very encouraging. And they like the idea, of course, that I think the internet should be left alone and that we shouldn't tax it and we shouldn't regulate the internet, which is good. But the internet, of course, is a source of evil and monstrous things. Responsibility should be on the government to regulate the internet. No, it's the responsibility of us. It's the responsibility of our parents, just as it was before we had the internet. We had books and we had magazines and movies and everything else that where kids could go astray. But in Washington, there is indeed a constitutional crisis. Congress reneges on their responsibilities constantly. They give up their prerogatives to the executive branch, especially in foreign policy, which is a total disaster. And I just told a story just a little while ago that I'm going to repeat about the lack of respect and understanding of the separations of power. I was on the Education Committee. A bill came up, obviously unconstitutional. I raised the subject and asked the question, and I says, how can we pass this? There's no authority in the Constitution to do this. And the chairman of the Education Committee said that, and he sort of put me down. He says, that is not our responsibility. The courts will deal with this later on and decide whether it's constitutional or not. And he said that with a clear face, like, that's the way it works. The courts are there to decide. What do we take an oath for? You know, but once again, the people we have in Washington are put there by us. The people are electing them. So it's a reflection on us that we haven't done a good enough job to send only people over there that understand and hold their feet to the fire, and if they don't do it, they need to be removed. So I'd like to blame everybody in Washington, but it's still a responsibility for all of us, because we, in many ways, get the type of government that the majority wants. I can't say that people here want, because I know you.
I was wondering what your definition of the separation of church and state is, and how it will affect your decision making.
Congressman Paul, does faith have a role in these public issues, the public square, or is it a personal issue at your home and in your church?
I think faith has something to do with the character of the people who represent us. And law should have a moral fiber to it, and our leaders should. We shouldn't expect us to try to change morality. You can't teach people how to be moral. But the Constitution addresses this by saying, literally it says no theocracy, but it doesn't talk about church and state. The most important thing is the First Amendment. The Congress shall write no laws, which means Congress should never prohibit the expression of your Christian faith in a public place.
Okay, great.
I think the issue is obviously very important, and we can charge one side or the other of influencing our culture too much. But the goal of government isn't to mold society and mold people. The role of government is to preserve liberty, so we as individuals assume the responsibility and our families assume responsibility. Our values should come from our family and from our church. But once we say, well, the liberals are doing this because they want this economic interference and we're going to have perfect balance and fairness, they overdo it. But you can do it on both sides. You can say, well, we're going to make people better by having more laws. I think culture is very important. Culture has a reflection on the law, and I think that is very good. But the law can't reflect the morality of the people. If you do that, you have embarked on something where you sacrifice liberty. Once you turn this over to government, when government assumes this role, it can only do that at the sacrifice of liberty. So our goal ought to be to preserve liberty so that we have our religious values and we make our own decisions. If we can make our self-determination for our hereafter and our spiritual life, certainly on our own personal habits and our economic habits and how we spend our money, certainly we should assume that the people can do this. The guidance should come from individuals, from our family, and from our church. You know, I think it's wrong to assume that if you legalize liberty and freedom, that because somebody might do something wrong, you don't want to legalize it. Liberty doesn't mean libertine. It means you have choices, but you suffer the consequences. It does not mean endorsement. When you legalize freedom of choice, think about it in a religious sense. We legalize, and we do a pretty good job in this country on the First Amendment. We legalize our freedom of choice in our religious value. But in this country, you're even allowed to be an atheist. But if you say, well, there's the danger of being atheist, so we can't legalize freedom of choice in religion, or we can't legalize freedom. Maybe somebody will want too many homeschoolers. So no, you want to legalize liberty. You don't want to designate what your beliefs are going to be, because somebody might abuse it and they have to assume the responsibility for making the mistakes. But because somebody might make a bad choice, you don't say give up on liberty. This is what the liberals do when they come to economics. Somebody might not make a good choice. They might not take care of themselves. They might not save for them for their retirement. So therefore, we have to be the protector. We have to protect the people from themselves. So I think overall the defense of liberty is really what we need in this country, because we're losing it, unfortunately.
I get to my God through Christ. Christ to me is a man of peace. He is for peace. He's not for war. He doesn't justify preemptive declared war. I strongly believe that there is a Christian doctrine of just war, and I believe this nation has drifted from that. no matter what the rationales are, we have drifted from that, and it's very, very dangerous, and I see in many ways being unchristian. And to justify what we do in the name of Christianity, I think is very dangerous and not part of what Christianity is all about. Christ came here for spiritual reasons, not secular war and boundaries and geography. And yet we are now dedicating so much of our aggressive activity in the name of God. But God, He is the Prince of Peace. That is what I see from my God, and through Christ, I vote for peace.
I want to ask you about something that came up last night. You didn't get to weigh in. I'm going to let you weigh in now. This kerfuffle over Mitt Romney and his Mormonism and what Rick Perry said. I know you're looking like, what is that doing? Here, let me show you something that really astounded me, frankly, Congressman, that Newt Gingrich said last night.
That there's a very central part of your faith in how you approach public life. And I, frankly, would be really worried if somebody assured me that nothing in their faith would affect their judgments. Because then I'd wonder, where's your judgment? How can you have judgment if you have no faith? And how can I trust you with power if you don't pray?
How can you have judgment if you don't have faith? How can I trust you with power if you don't pray? Do those not astonish you, those statements?
Yes, and I'm not quite sure exactly what's going through his mind, but it does stir your thinking on exactly. You know, the way I see this is religious values. I'm a Christian, and I think it's important, but I don't believe that we should have a religious test for office obviously. And I think...
Do atheists not have a say if you don't believe in God?
Well, the thing, let me finish my thoughts.
Okay.
Our religious values should affect our character, and our character should affect maybe the way you'll look at me. You know, if I have the proper character, then you might vote for me. If I don't, then you vote against me. But I think what we need to do, though, is ask more questions about what's your interpretation of the First Amendment. See, I don't care about their personal. I care about their character, and maybe it's related to their religion. But
maybe not too, right?
Yeah,
maybe not. I mean, an atheist can have good character,
that
right?
is true.
Yeah.
So the litmus test is, how do you interpret and how important do you think the First Amendment is? And that is where the test is, and that is where I think a lot of conservatives come up short, because they vary it a lot, and they say, well, it's good to have the First Amendment, but don't use it in a certain way. And sometimes they get freedom of speech mixed up. There's commercial speech and political speech, and they divide it up. And I want an understanding of what the First Amendment really means, and certainly we should. This whole thing, and I think the media frenzy feeds into this when this came up with Romney and Perry, of subtly saying, well, we are going to have a religious test. And it's the only reason I think religion is important is the reflection it has on character. And you are right, people can be ethical and have character even though they might not have what we call religious values.
But we don't have the First Amendment, and most people recognize this. We don't have the First Amendment so that we can talk about the weather. You know, we have the First Amendment to talk about controversial things and say express controversial ideas and criticize our leaders and all. Everybody knows that. And we know that it applies to our religion. You can have no religion or a lot of religion as long as you don't force it on other people. We're not to have a theocracy. And we know that we shouldn't meddle with our intellectual life. We know that the government shouldn't meddle with our religious life, and our religious life has to deal with something pretty important, like our eternity and our salvation, and we get to make our own choices what we do on that matter.
I was wondering what your definition of the separation of church and state is, and how it will affect your decision-making.
Congressman Paul, does faith have a role in these public issues, the public square, or is it a personal issue at your home and in your church?
I think faith has something to do with the character of the people who represent us. And law should have a moral fiber to it, and our leaders should. We shouldn't expect us to try to change morality. You can't teach people how to be moral. But the Constitution addresses this by saying, literally it says no theocracy, but it doesn't talk about church and state. The most important thing is the First Amendment. The Congress shall write no laws, which means Congress should never prohibit the expression of your Christian faith in a public place.
Okay.
Sexuality. Should gays be allowed to marry?
Sure.
The state says we believe in this?
Sure, they can do whatever they want, and they can call it whatever they want, just so they don't expect to impose their relationship on somebody else. They can't make me personally accept what they do, but they can, gay couples can do whatever they want. Matter of fact, I'd like to see all governments out of the marriage question. I don't think it's a state function. I think it's a religious function. And there was a time when only churches dealt with, marriage. And they determined what it was. But 100 years or so ago, for health reasons, they claimed that the state would protect us if we knew more about our spouses, and we did health testing, and you had to get a license to get married. And I don't agree with that.
New Hampshire is one of 5 states where individuals who happen to be gay can marry legally. This is a question of conflicting interests. I know you're opposed to same-sex marriage. As president, would you try to overturn, what influence would you use from the White House to try to overturn these state laws, despite your own personal belief that states should handle their own affairs whenever possible and in many circumstances?
Describe it this way. Are you a George W. Bush Republican, meaning a constitutional amendment to ban same-sex marriage, or a Dick Cheney Republican, who, like I believe the Congresswoman just said, says this should be made, this decision, same-sex marriage, should be a state's decision? Okay, let's just go through.
The federal government shouldn't be involved. I wouldn't support an amendment, but let me suggest one of the ways to solve this ongoing debate about marriage, look up the dictionary, we know what marriage is all about, but then get the government out of it. Why doesn't it go to the church, and why doesn't it go to the individuals? I don't think government should give us a license to get married. It should be in the church.
This question is for Representative Paul. You've often said you believe defining marriage is a job that should be left to the states. Recently, Senator Santorum asked, if a state wanted to allow polygamy, would that be okay too? What's your answer to that?
Well, that's sort of like asking the question if the states wanted to legalize slavery or something like that. That is so past reality that no state is going to do that. But on the issue of marriage, I think marriage should be between a single man and a single woman, and that the federal government shouldn't be involved. I want less government involvement. I don't want the federal government having a marriage police. I want the states to deal with it if they have to, if they need to. But if you didn't even need the states, really, why do we have to have a license to get married? Why don't we just go to the church? And what other individuals do, why can't we permit them to do it? Whatever they call it, that's their problem, not mine. Just so nobody else forces their definition of marriage on you. That is what we have to prevent. So I would say less government would be better. If you have to have regulations, let the state governments do it.
Congressman Paul, in 2007, in an interview, you were asked, should gays be allowed to marry? You said, quote, sure, they can do whatever they want and call it whatever they want. Are you advocating legalizing gay marriage in this country?
Well, matter of fact, I spent a whole chapter in a new book I've written on marriage. And I think it's very important, and seeing that I've been married for 53, 54 years now. But I think the government should just be out of it. I think it should be done by the church or private contract, and we shouldn't have this argument. Who's married and who isn't married? I have my standards, but I shouldn't have to impose my standards on others. Others have standards, and they have no right to impose their marriage standards on me. And I just don't like it. But if we want to have something to say about marriage, it should be at the state level and not at the federal government. Just get the government out of it. It's one area where it's totally unnecessary, and they've caused more trouble than necessary.
All right. Given that answer, I have to ask you about your defense of the Defense of Marriage Act, which defines marriage as between one man and one woman. Even just weeks ago, you criticized this administration for its decision to no longer defend it against legal challenges.
And the main reason there is the Defense of Marriage Act. And I've been quoted as I voted for it. Of course, I supported it, but I wasn't there. But because that bill actually protects the states. See, I do recognize that the federal government shouldn't tell the states what to do, and the Defense of Marriage Act was really designed to make sure that the states have the privilege of dealing with it, and the federal government can't impose their standards on them. What you need to do is attack their benefits. No free education, no free subsidies, no citizenship, no birthright citizenship. No birthright citizenship.
And you want to get rid of the birthright law that says that an illegal immigrant who gives birth in America, the child is a U.S. citizen.
Yes, I think there's confusion on interpreting the 14th Amendment. It says that if you're under the jurisdiction of the United States, you have a right to citizenship if you're born here.
All right, so you say this is good, but that's in there.
Yes, but it's a little bit confusing. If you step over the border and you're illegal, are you really under the jurisdiction? There's a question on that, and I want to clarify it.
Now, as you know, children of undocumented immigrants who are born in the United States are U.S. citizens, just like you and me. Do you like that idea? Is that okay?
I just think the mere fact of stepping across the border and having a child, and I'm an OB doctor, and I had to take care of a lot of emergencies, deliveries, and people came for the sole purpose of that. No, I don't think that should be automatic. I think that we should have more control of our borders.
So you want to change the Constitution? Is that what you're saying?
Well, it depends on how you interpret the Constitution. You know, under the jurisdiction is the big issue there, and that's why it's so often debated. You know, what does under the jurisdiction mean? If you're illegal, you might not be considered under the jurisdiction of the U.S. government.
Congressman Paul, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
Let me start right away with your immigration policy. I would like to know, what are you going to do with the 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country? What's your plan?
Well, I'm going to call up Solomon and ask him for the wisdom of Solomon to deal with it. I do not believe it's possible, even if you wanted to round up 11 million people and send them off. I have no desire to do that, but it still leaves questions on, you know, exactly what you do. And I think we should have secure borders. I don't think you should reward people for breaking the law. So I don't think people should be able to come easily and become easily, you know, citizens and get to vote and go on food stamps and get welfare. But in the same sense, somebody's been here and it's almost, you know, it is their country. I think there should be a program to bring them into the fold. You know, the green carding and let people come but qualify. But I want it to be done, you know, systematically. I think we need more efficiency at our borders. And allow the people to come in, especially the people who will work and take care of themselves.
But you just mentioned a program. What kind of program? Are you suggesting that there should be a program to legalize 11 million undocumented immigrants?
Yeah, I don't think we should. I think legalizing is one thing, that they're not criminals, and let people, you know, get a work permit or, you know, work within the system. But if everybody who comes illegally is automatically given citizenship and a vote and can apply for welfare, that would not be a good format, because then we would have more of it. You ask about what we do with 11 million, and I would say you have to work out a program of assimilation, but you can't just say borders don't count and people should be rewarded for breaking the law. I don't believe in that.
Can you tell us for sure that the Tea Party is not anti-immigrant?
I can't tell you a thing about it because it's sort of all over the place. At one time, the Tea Party was started with what we were doing 4 years ago, and they were very anti-war, anti-Federal Reserve, and they weren't anti-immigrant. But masses of number of people came in and sort of co-opted, you know, the system, and they tried to change the message. And nobody has control of the Tea Party movement, except for the fact that most of them are just unhappy with the status quo, and they're unhappy with being lied to by so many politicians in this country.
The most commonly cited statistic for the number of illegal immigrants living in the United States is 12 million people. Is it desirable, is it even practical, to try to send them all home? If the next Congress passes comprehensive immigration reform that includes a path to citizenship, will you sign it, or will you support sending the 12 million home?
I'm very sorry, but I didn't hear your last sentence because of the acoustics.
In the next Congress, if the next Congress passes immigration reform that includes a path to citizenship, will you sign it, or will you support sending the 12 million home?
I would not sign a bill like you described, because it would be construed and it would be amnesty, and I haven't supported amnesty. I also think that it's pretty impractical to get an army in this country to round up 12 or maybe 20 million. But I do believe that we have to stick to our guns and obeying the law, and anybody who comes in here illegally shouldn't be rewarded. And that would be the case. But I see the immigration problem as a consequence of our welfare state. Welfare because we encourage people not to work here, but the welfare we offer the people who come, they get free medical care, they get free education, they bankrupt our hospitals are closing, and it should not be rewarded. That means that if you don't round them up, you don't reward them, you don't give them citizenship. At the same time, you can't solve this problem until you get rid of the welfare state, because in a healthy economy, immigrants wouldn't be a threat to us. There would probably be a desire for more because we would be starved for workers. But today, they have become scapegoated because of the weak economy and the lowering of our standard of living.
Immigration. You want a 700-mile fence between our border and Mexico?
Not really. There was an immigration bill that had a fence in it, but there was to attack amnesty. I don't like amnesty, so I voted for that bill to stop the amnesty, but I didn't like the fence. I don't think the fence can solve a problem. I find it rather offensive.
What should we do?
Get rid of the subsidies. You subsidize illegal immigration, you get more of it.
Get rid of welfare. Get rid of
all the welfare benefits.
Health care for...
Absolutely.
So if someone's illegal and they show up at the hospital and they're injured, the hospital should do what?
Be charitable and have no mandates by the federal government. Catholics want to take care of their offering to help a lot of these people. We want to punish them in some of these, reform bills. I'm not for that. But we wouldn't have so many there if they didn't know they were going to get amnesty. You promise them amnesty, promise them that no sweat, you can get medical care and free education, automatic citizenship, food stamps, and Social Security, you're going to get more of it. But I want a free and healthy, thriving economy. And I think we could be much more generous with our immigration. We don't need illegal immigration. We don't need to reward people who get in front of the line. I want people
But the legal line should be more generous.
I do. I really think we would be. I think it would be a non-issue. Today it's a big issue because people are hurting. They can't keep up with paying their bills. When they see people in the line using food stamps, they'll be in the emergency rooms, they'll demand bilingual education in the schools, and the costs are going up, school taxes go up.
Get rid of all those programs, everyone.
I would. I think get rid of the incentives and work toward a real solution, which means that you do it legally and you have a healthy economy. And we would have probably a lot of people coming back and forth working in this country. There was a time when we had just workers coming back and forth. That was when they didn't expect to get easy amnesty.
What about the millions who are here illegally already? Deport them?
I don't think anybody could find them. I don't think anybody knows where they are. I don't think if you had a million-man army, nobody even knows how many there are. But if they come for welfare benefits and you know they're illegal, yes, deny them the benefits, and they commit a crime, send them home when you know they're there. Today, in many cities, you're not even allowed to ask them their immigrant status. It might be on the form. Policemen told me, don't ask that question. They're told they can't ask that question to find out if they're illegal. And if they've been breaking the law, they're arrested. But it's politically incorrect to ask a person their immigrant status, because that would say, well, if you're broken the law, maybe you ought to go home. Unfortunately, our foreign policy has been designed to spend money and make our efforts protecting borders between North and South Korea, and between Syria and Iraq, which I don't think we should be involved in. And besides, some of our border guards are over in Iraq. I think they'd be better off on our borders, protecting our borders, not in Iraq. So, yes, I think we have to deal with it. If we don't do it with carefully, yeah, we're going to lose some votes on it. But quite frankly, the law is the law, and we should enforce the law.
But I take the position which probably doesn't satisfy too many on either end, because the purest libertarian viewpoint is totally open borders, right? And I don't endorse that. I don't think we are quite able to do that as long as people can come in here and benefit from the welfare system, and they're compelled to be taken care of. I don't believe in the open borders, but I don't like the idea of people wanting to build walls and fences and guns and thinking that the immigrant is the evil monster and the immigrant becomes
the scapegoat of everything. I think that's very, very bad. But it is a difficult problem. I do not support amnesty. I think if somebody sneaks across the border and somebody else is trying to follow the rules and can't get in, that they come across and soon they can become citizens and get to vote. So, but there's no way
amnesty that they should.
No, I'm not for amnesty. But it's absolutely impossible to think that anybody, no matter how strongly people feel against illegals, you're not going to round up 12 or 15 million people. I mean, that doesn't make any sense.
Oh, hey, my friend, how are you?
Good evening. Nice to see you all. Nice to see you all. I want to talk about a subject that was very dear to the heart of President Reagan, which was immigration reform. As you know, he was the last U.S. president to sign immigration reform in 1986. All of you, I think, have said that you don't think immigration reform should be discussed until the border is secure. And, Governor, I'd like to ask you, border state governor, what specifically, in your mind, would make the border secure? Congressman, your thoughts.
Obviously, it's a very big problem. I think we need to remove the incentive, easy road to citizenship. Nobody has mentioned the fact that they qualify for benefits as well, the welfare benefits that we shouldn't have to give. The state of Texas shouldn't be forced to provide free health care and free education. But there is a mess down there. It's a big mess, and it's the drug war that's going on there. And our drug laws are driving this. So now we're killing thousands and thousands of people. That makes it much more complicated. But the people who want big fences and guns, sure, we could secure the borders. A barbed wire fence with machine guns, that would do the trick. I don't believe that's what America is all about. I just really don't. We can enforce our law. If we had a healthy economy, this wouldn't be such a bad deal. People are worrying about jobs. But every time you think about this toughness on the border and ID cards and real IDs, think that it's a penalty against the American people, too. I think this fence business is designed and may well be used against us and keep us in. In economic turmoil, the people want to leave with their capital, and there's capital controls and there's people control. So every time you think of a fence keeping all those bad people out, think about those fences maybe being used against us, keeping us in.
Answering questions. Congressman Paul, I want to ask you a question about a comment you made a couple of weeks ago about a border fence with Mexico. Here's what you said, sir. I want to quote it. There's capital controls and there's people control. So every time you think of a fence keeping all those bad people out, think about those fences maybe being used against us, keeping us in. Question, Congressman, do you know a lot of Americans who want to take their money and flee the United States of America?
There are some. All the candidates up here talk about repatriation of dollars. They've already taken them overseas. We're talking about trying to bring in $1.5 trillion because they leave our country because we make it uncomfortable. Too many regulations, too much taxation. They can't start business. They've lost confidence. Yes, when countries destroy a currency, they do lead to capital controls and they lead to people control. So I think it is a real concern. And also, once you have these data banks, the data banks means that everybody's going to be in the data bank. You say, oh no, the data bank's there for the illegals. But everybody's in the data bank. That's national ID card. If you care about your personal liberty, you'll be cautious when you feel comfortable. Blame all the illegal immigrants for everything. What you need to do is attack their benefits. No free education, no free subsidies, no citizenship, no birthright citizenship. And that would get to the bottom of it a lot sooner. But economically, you should not ignore the fact that in tough economic times, money and people want to leave the country. That's unfortunate.
Congressman Paul, thank you very much, sir.
Congressman Paul, you're opposed to a system that requires employers to verify the immigration status of their workers. Why would you want to eliminate one more tool to help curb illegal immigration?
I don't like putting the burden on our businessman to be the policeman. That means he has to be a policing activity. And I also resent the fact that illegals come into this country and they do have problems, but if a church helps them and feeds them, we don't blame the church, or at least we shouldn't in a free society. But I have a strong position on immigration. immigration. I don't think that we should give amnesty and they become voters, but I do think we should deal with our borders. But one way that I would suggest that we could do it is pay a lot less attention to the borders between Afghanistan and Iraq and Pakistan, and bring our troops home and deal with the border. But why do we pay more attention to the borders overseas and less attention to the borders here at home? We now we have a mess on the borders, and it has a lot more to do with it than just immigration, because we're financing some of this militarism against the drug dealers on the borders right now to the tune of over $1 billion. And there is a mess down there, but it's much bigger than just the immigration problem. But I do not believe in giving entitlements to illegal immigrants at all, and there should be no mandates on the states to make them do it.
You allege that the Bilderberg Group runs the world. Who are they exactly?
The Bilderberg Group is the Queen of England, the Queen of the Netherlands. It is the Rockefellers. It is the Rothschilds. They write books. They brag about it. David Rockefeller wrote a book 4 years ago saying he wants world government and end to U.S. sovereignty. And they are these incredibly wealthy, powerful families that play with nations and whole populations like they're a little toy. And they are outside the laws. They don't have to follow the laws of the nations they control. And they come in and buy off the governments and finance those governments to go along with their aims. And the New World Order is just a super rich international mafia of oligarchs that are playing God, who want to abolish and bankrupt nation states so they can set up an international order where the planet is owned by a private bank. Well, we know a lot about the Bilderberg Group. It was officially founded in 1954 at the Bilderberg Hotel in the Netherlands, and that's why it gets its name, Club Bilderberg. But really, it was a meeting of what was left of the European financial elite, the German financial elite, the Krumps, and others that had funded Hitler with the Anglo-American, British, U.S. elite. And so kind of a teaming up during the Marshall Plan of those two groups, and declassified U.S. Army documents that have been covered by major British and U.S. newspapers confirm that actually the Nazis, when they were losing in 1944, planned to put their money into offshore corporations to try to have a rebirth of the Fourth Reich. The Third Reich as a Fourth Reich through a corporate system based around a European Union. And so it's on record that the Nazi Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, consort to the Queen, Queen Beatrix, actually set up the Bilderberg Group meeting officially in '54, but it was set up really before that. And so it is an international group. Many of their minutes have been released, stolen by the press, but the Bilderberg Group has recently even given interviews. Etienne Davignon, the Viscount that is the chairman of it, admitting that they set up the European Union by stealth. So this is world domination by 130 of the richest royalty and financial oligarchs and industrial oligarchs in the world, who combine their forces together to overthrow democratic processes worldwide and to bring in a one world government run by private international banks that we will pay our fraudulent, fake carbon taxes to. In all these decades, we've warned people. They've now admitted it all and are kind of coming out in the open, announcing they want a world government to control every facet of our lives. So this is world tyranny, world imperialism by a group of private banks that use command and control economies, socialist economies predominantly, to socialize the country's wealth, but then conduit that to the private bankers above them. Sure, we know quite a bit now because of declassified Army documents that have been in the U.S. and British press recently. Also, Bilderberg has become more arrogant because they've already been exposed, so why not go public? Releasing documents how they covertly set up the European Union with the Treaty of Rome in 1957, though the public's told the European Union was set up in 2000. The Bilderberg Group is 130 royalty, bankers, heads of industry, who've been officially meeting since 1954, and their stated goal is to set up global governance or world government based around a European Union in allied operations with the Anglo-American establishment based in the United States and England. And in 1954 was the first official meeting, but it's been declassified in U.S. Army documents that the Germans knew they were going to lose by 1944. So they decided to put their hundreds of billions of dollars of stolen loot into dummy corporations to then set up a European Union in the near future. And so the Bilderberg Group is a merger of Nazi assets with the Anglo-American establishment for world domination against Russia, China, Central and South America, and Asia and Africa. And this is what the globalism is, what the New World Order is. So they're bankrupting the world economy by design, and we had sources inside Bilderberg this year that confirmed this. They're bankrupting the world economy by design, lowering oil prices by design to bankrupt Saudi Arabia, Russia, Venezuela. And by the way, George Soros, since we broke this months ago, has bragged at Davos that, oh yes, they've lowered oil prices to bankrupt things. So they're very proud of this to exacerbate the world depression so they can then pose as the saviors, bringing in a new financial architecture, giving themselves even more power for the new Bank of the World that we will pay our carbon taxes to. So this is a hellish system. It's not free market. It is private oligarchs who are tired of having to work through governments they control, openly setting up a world government of their own, and then having the governments that they bought and paid for sign on through treaties as signatures through that system. And Bilderberg 2009 had the greatest security that we've ever seen. Bilderberg 2009, they arrested dozens and dozens of private citizens just walking down the beach. London Guardian reporter Charlie Skelton was arrested twice. American Free Press reporters were arrested. Just regular tourists for a 2.5-mile area were arrested. They had the Army, the Navy, the Marines out guarding it there in Greece, right outside Athens. Just absolutely amazing. And the list of the Bilderberg Group, which they now release, is out. And we do now know what their agenda for 2009-2010 is. The agenda is to accelerate the depression worldwide and to make it as bad as they can and as fast as they can so that they can bring the world to their knees, panic the public into giving into this new financial world government architecture that will openly be run by a private consortium of central bank owning families. And so they're making a mad gamble for the entire planet. They also want to set up a World Health Organization as a global health department with control over every nation. They want their new International Criminal Court. They want all nations to sign on to that and waive all their sovereign rights. They want to increase the size of the world army built around NATO. They want to smash the anti-Libsyn treaty movements because every time Europe gets a chance to vote, which they normally don't against the Euro expansion, they say no. So they're very upset that France has said no. Others have, countries like Ireland have said no. So they're going to try to force another vote. And if that fails, they're just going to have the European Union Parliament implement these expansions of powers without having a vote. So we see Europe literally just descending into the depths of fascism, literally from the ashes of the Third Reich. We see the rising of a Fourth Reich, which is a bizarre mutation and a hybrid between the British Empire, the U.S. Empire, and the Nazi Empire.
120 of the world's most powerful men, heads of state from Europe, high officials of the United States government, Treasury, White House, state, defense, they're setting the world agenda now. The reason they want secrecy is because they're doing evil. Evil is done under the cover of darkness. Good works are done in the sunshine.
Did you hear about that recent Bilderberg Group meeting in what was it, Shantyville, Virginia?
Yeah, recently there was one, and there was some reports on it. I didn't read a whole lot about it, but
Man.
they certainly were there.
What do you think they're doing there? Seriously, what do you think they're doing there?
Well, they probably get together and talk about how they're going to control the banking systems of the world and natural resources. And we get together and we talk about how we're going to get our freedom back. So we have our own things to talk about too.
You have the Trilateral Commission that's also part of the Bilderberg, which is the United States, Europe, and Asia. But most of this is public knowledge. Nobody wants to believe that there are conspiracies, that world leaders are already elected before they're voted on. So here we know that Bernard Lord is part of the outer circle. I was surprised to read that Harper addressed the group in 2003 because my understanding was nobody gets into politics without becoming part of the Bilderberg group. And then you find out afterwards that that is the case, that they have...
Well, yeah, well, Bill Clinton went there in 91, George Bush Sr. back in like 85.
And Blair, same thing, who we think that we're electing as leaders have already been pre-picked for us. Whether it's liberal or a conservative, they're already part of the group.
They own all the horses in the race.
They own the horses, and I understand that, for example, in the United States, it's a one-party system with two factions, though you think it's two different parties.
Oh, it is, yeah.
So
it's like Bill Clinton constantly vacations with the Bushes, and they call him their son, and they actually staged all that in '92, and all that's come out. It's just all staged. They're not going to let trillions of dollars slip through their hands. The good news is people are waking
up. Because my understanding was nobody gets into politics without becoming part of the Bilderberg group. And then you find out afterwards that that is the case, that they have...
Well, yeah, well, Bill Clinton went there in 91, George Bush Sr. back in like 85.
And Blair, same thing, who we think that we're electing as leaders have already been pre-picked for us. Whether it's liberal or a conservative, they're already part of the group.
They own all the horses in the race.
Jim, my governor, Rick Perry, it's in the front of the Dallas Morning News. The headline reads, Texas Governor Rick Perry to attend Bilderberg. What does it mean to have the governor of Texas in the Dallas Morning News just admitting he's going to Bilderberg Group?
It means he's a potential president, even as the obscure governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton, lost his virginity at the Bilderberg meeting in Baden-Baden, Germany in 1991, and he's elected president the following year. Now, if he goes nowhere in a run for the White House in the years ahead, they'll drop him like an old shoe. They do that often, but officially, Bilderberg considers Governor Rick Perry a potential president of the United States. Yes, it's a violation of the Logan Act, for which Bill Clinton's White House was fined $300,000, which means the taxpayers paid it. Yes, it's a violation of the Logan Act, for which Bill Clinton's White House was fined $300,000, which means the taxpayers paid it.
Under the Logan Act, it is a felony offense for any member of the federal or state government to meet with members of a foreign government without the express authority and authorization of the President or Congress. Put simply, it is illegal for members of the government to meet secretly behind closed doors with foreign power brokers due to the problems of corruption and espionage that it breeds.
Mr. Perry, another last question. We saw in the news that you attended the Bilderberg meeting. I'm just curious, what exactly goes on there that is so closed doors? In other
I
words,
have no idea. You know, I was invited to come and speak, and that's what I told him. I said, I have no idea what's so secret about this. I talked about energy policy.
So you didn't stay there for the rest of their meeting, or?
Oh, I heard probably, I don't know, a number of the speeches, but there wasn't anything that, there was no conspiracy going on that I saw. Matter of fact, all I did was get in a big fight with a lady about global warming.
And just one last question along those lines, and we're running out of time. When you took the job as head of the Republican Governors Association, did you have to make a commitment that you would not run for president?
Oh, I've made that commitment every time I've been asked, and that commitment still stands. I don't want to be the President of the United States. I do want to work with these governors across the country to make the states more pivotal, more powerful, as they should be.
Before the 2010 election, KVUE sat down with Governor Rick Perry and asked him point blank, would he run for president?
No. Would you accept the nomination as a vice presidential candidate? No. No, no, and no.
No, no, and no.
Rick Perry's actions speak louder than words. Everything he's done so far tells the world, I'm running for president. And our inside sources confirm that's exactly what he's planning to do. That's right. Texas Governor Rick Perry has announced that he's running for the Republican nomination for president in 2012. And you're hearing it here first at Infowars.com. Now, as the world media tunes in to this video, they're saying, well, where else do we have this information? Well, you see, officially, Rick Perry hasn't announced that he's running for president, but in the real world, he has. And I want to talk about that right now. Almost 4 years ago, I released a film called Endgame, Blueprint for Global Enslavement, where we predicted that Rick Perry would be running for president coming up in 2012.
Now, Jim, my governor, Rick Perry, it's in the front of the Dallas Morning News. The headline reads, Texas Governor Rick Perry to attend Bilderberg. What does it mean to have the governor of Texas in the Dallas Morning News just admitting he's going to Bilderberg Group?
It means he's a potential president. Officially, Bilderberg considers Governor Rick Perry a potential president of the United States.
And he indeed is now positioning himself for that. You see, he told you that he had a pledge that he was not going to run for president in 2012, but now he's rethinking that pledge. To go through all the data is mind-boggling, but bottom line here, we have sources inside Fox News. We have sources inside Rick Perry's security detail. After all, I live here in Austin, Texas, been on the radio and TV for 16 plus years, and we've known that for more than a decade, Rick Perry has been groomed to run for president by none other than Karl Rove, who back in the mid-1990s got him to flip from Democrat to Republican. And he was in that same stable as Senator Graham, of course, later President Bush, and now Governor Rick Perry. And so it was Karl Rove who basically put him in the position he is today. The inside baseball from sources in media, Texas Monthly, Fox News, inside the Perry camp, including people that work not just in his security, but in his office. Everything from day one has been about Rick Perry being president. And now the media is saying he is the front runner, even when he has not even announced yet. So Rick Perry let us know that he had announced for president with the establishment, with the people that bankroll presidential candidates when he went to Bilderberg in 2007. And we were on the scene documenting the fact that Rick Perry was basically there begging to be the heir apparent and that he was chosen. The modern political manipulators are masters at building up a candidate as the answer to all your problems. Everybody was mad at George W. Bush. So here comes Barack H. Obama, financed by the very same Wall Street interest. We are on record calling it, that Rick Perry would be positioned to run for president. And now it's happening. But he plays the part of this reluctant candidate. Oh, dear, I've put out the presidential book of Fed Up. Oh, dear, I'm going to all the big conservative conferences and talking about how much I love Jesus. Oh, dear, I don't want to run. And then Rush Limbaugh and all the other big kingmakers come out and say, come on, Perry, we're drafting you. You've got to do it. You're the only one that will save us. The whole thing is 100% scripted. So let's look at Rick Perry's record. We already talked about the fact that he was a Democrat who was flipped by Karl Rove. But since then, as he rose up through Texas politics to the governorship, we have seen an extremely duplicitous politician in an overall field of lying scallywags. He is a master manipulator. Let's fast forward to 2007. The incumbent governor travels to Bilderberg to be vetted by the global elite, just as Bill Clinton, the obscure Arkansas governor, traveled there in 1991 to then be catapulted in 1992 and 93 to the presidency of the United States. A few years later, the obscure, even more obscure, member of parliament, Tony Blair, went to Bilderberg, bowed down before them, pledged to push England into the European Union. He becomes the new heir apparent and is put in as British Prime Minister. Well, Rick Perry had studied history, and his advisors had explained to him that bowing down to the globalists was key, and he'll ensure that somebody like Ron Paul, who doesn't have the fancy hair of Rick Perry, but has the constitutionalist record, is defeated. If you so-called rhino conservatives buy into Rick Perry, you get what you deserve. So there you have it. Rick Perry has announced he's running for president. I've got it from inside his campaign, and all his actions announce he's running. But he even betrayed you in that. This guy's like the devil, saying, I pledge I'll never run for president. Now, oh, I rethought my pledge. And another chapter we'll tell later is all the dirt on Rick Perry that the establishment is going to use to blackmail him.
And then the last two selections, which they call elections, and then the last two selections, which they call elections, and then the last two selections, which they call elections, and then the last two selections, which they call elections, never did anything for me.
We like to say in this country that we have the ability as Americans to elect. But the problem is we do not have the ability to select. We can only elect, which means that we can only vote for those candidates which are put before us by our masters. We like to say in this country that we have the ability as Americans to elect. But the problem is we do not have the ability to select. We can only elect, which means that we can only vote for those candidates which are put before us by our masters, our hidden masters behind the scenes. And when you understand that the Democratic and the Republican Party are financed, and believe me, in this world, money is the bottom line. If you have it or if you don't. And the Democratic and the Republican Party are financed and organized and directed by the same banking families. The same people who finance your banks are the same people who finance your institutions of government.
Aaron Dykes, give us a report on this, and we'll document Cam over there where you're at as well, so people can see the articles you've got. Break down Lord Kane for us.
Look, as a politician, he's being sold as another phony outsider independent. Not true. He owes his whole career to the Skull and Bones Pillsbury cartel family, and that's not an independent business. That destroys independent business, contributes to bad health, and all the rest of it.
And Pillsbury is total pimp level. They're right at the top.
But remember, in 2008 presidential race, John McCain didn't have a polls. He didn't even show up in the polls until Giuliani dropped out. Then suddenly he rose to prominence. They have these people waiting in the wings. Palin's waiting in the wings. People like Herman Cain are waiting in the wings if they can't sell Perry and the rest of them. Now, Herman Cain himself started at the Department of the Navy, then worked for the...
By the way, that's where they get their top minions, is out of the Navy, and they sheep dip them into intelligence from that. That's a big point right there.
That's right. Then he worked for the Coca-Cola Company as a business analyst.
Totally selected.
Congressman, are you feeling the dread that many of us are feeling right now?
Yes, I do, but I don't think it's brand new. I didn't wake up with it. I've had it for a while. I don't think the election was a surprise, but the rhetoric is getting pretty strong, and they are getting very bold. I think McCain was obviously backup candidate in case something happened where Obama didn't win. They'd have been satisfied with McCain. But they've been positioning Obama for a long, long time. He's a man of the people, and yet he was the first guy to spend, more money than anybody else. He probably spent more money than everybody else put together in these last 2 years, and that was, on the books it's about $750 million. But when you look at all the free stuff and you look at all the things that have gone on in the last 3 or 4 years, I consider the fact that he's probably had a $2 billion campaign. But we have to realize this started a long time before he even announced to be president. If anybody who would have gotten that much favorable coverage for so long, you know that the plans are laid for him to be the individual that is going to be taking care of the corporate elite. You know that the plans are laid for him to be the individual that is going to be taking care of the corporate elite.
In your work, you talk a lot about the New World Order. What is the New World Order?
The New World Order is a private group of ultra-rich bankers who are offshore. They're above the U.S., they're above Iran, Russia, Venezuela. They are international, and they are creating a network of international laws to regulate and control and dominate nations. They openly state that they want to deindustrialize countries, They want to bankrupt the population. They want a poor population that has to go to the government for handouts. They want a domesticated population. So the New World Order is what every other dictatorship is called for in history. They are people who want a planetary dictatorship run by a group of plutocratic financiers. It is world government of, for, and by private bankers.
And what you say is that the American government is a puppet of the New World Order. Is that right?
Absolutely. I am a patriot. I believe in the free market. I believe in the red, white, and blue Constitution, Bill of Rights. And everything that the supposed government is doing is the opposite of that. It is 180 degrees from what this nation is supposed to be. And in every poll, the American people are against the wars. They are against the open borders. They are against the police state. But the central government does the opposite of what the people wants, and they're setting up this control grid to try to suppress the American people.
So how do you see the future of American politics?
The United States is a corrupt empire that has been used by international banks and the global crime syndicate to expand their empire worldwide. They have basically used the United States like a credit card to pay for their world government. And I see the United States entering the greatest crisis since its founding 235 years ago. So I see the United States as a hijacked nation, a nation that is being used as a tool or an engine of international oligarchs, international financiers. I see the United States in danger of being collapsed, but at the same time I see a massive awakening to the globalist agenda taking place. And so I know that we have a fighting chance of defeating the tyranny.
Following up on that, some people go further and say that a collapse for America is inevitable. What do you say to that?
The globalists want to have a collapse in the United States. And yes, we are in a very real danger of collapsing because the central banks have gotten this country deep in debt. They've done it by design, and now they've cut off the money supply. And the economy for the last year has been in a free fall. Real unemployment's up at 20%. And so, yes, I've seen many scholars in the United States and worldwide talk about the collapse of the United States. That is a real danger. But again, the New World Order bankers only want to collapse the United States so that they can come back in, pose as the saviors, and bring control over the nation, and then reform the United States as a fascist engine to carry out military operations against any free nation in the world. They openly state that the United States will be the pit bull, the attack dog. The American people will be used to go after every free nation in the world. So the United States is in a process of going from a corrupt oligarchy to a fascistic, Hitlerian pit bull meant to go out and literally wage war against the planet. Meanwhile, the international financiers will sit in Switzerland and London and Paris and Berlin and blame America for all the tyranny when they own our private Federal Reserve and are launching the attack.
One of the things you talk about in your film is that the American government is allegedly trying to build a civil army to be able to use unsuspecting civilians for their own purposes. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yes. Legislation has passed the House and the Senate, and they're in the process right now of ratifying it, to create, in the words of the New York Times, a 7 million person army. And they openly state that citizens will be spying on each other, that this will be a paramilitary force domestically and internationally, to be a civilian force that after the U.S. military takes over a country, then this civilian military force will come in and administer the country. So the United States is being used as a colony of the offshore bankers to create a social service class to administer world government.
Some people say in the next couple of years there's going to be a revolution in America. Could that be possible?
The globalists hate America, but at the same time they know that the American people are waking up, and there's over 100 million armed American citizens who understand that being armed is a basic right and who refuse to be disarmed. And so, yes, we've gotten the internal government documents, the state police documents. They are very concerned about a revolution. because they know that as they bankrupt the nation, as they turn us into third world slaves, that the people will resist. And so they are attempting to set up a high-tech police state in the United States as a rearguard action, so that as they've stolen the country blind to build their world government, using the U.S.'s energy and money and finance to build it, now they're done with us. But the final phase is putting a police state in so they can successfully rob the United States without having the American people ever take control of the country and then prosecute them and arrest them.
Congressman Paul, can you speak as you have in the past to the New World Order's plan for a one-world government? Will they succeed? Will you stop them?
They're going to succeed if we don't do something about it.
Is there a plan for a New World Order, a one-world government, and how do we stop it?
Well, I think even our first President Bush said that the New World Order was in tune, and that's what they were working for. The UN is part of that government. They're working right now very significantly for a North American Union. That's why there's a lot of people in Washington that don't care too much about our borders. They have a philosophic belief that national sovereignty is not important. It's also the reason I have made very strong suggestion that we need not be in the United Nations for our national security.
We've got another question from a YouTube watcher. Let's watch, please.
Good evening, candidates. This is Seekster from Arlington, Texas, and this question is for Ron Paul. I've met a lot of your supporters online, but I've noticed that a good number of them seem to buy into this conspiracy theory regarding the Council of Foreign Relations and some plan to make a North American Union by merging the United States with Canada and Mexico. These supporters of yours seem to think that you also believe in this theory. So my question to you is, do you really believe in all this, or are people just putting words in your mouth?
90 seconds.
Well, it all depends on what you mean by all of this. The CFR exists, the Trilateral Commission exists, and it's a, quote, conspiracy of ideas. This is an ideological battle. Some people believe in globalism, others of us believe in national sovereignty. And there is a move on toward a North American Union, just like early on, there was a move on for a European Union, and it eventually ended up. So we had NAFTA and moving toward a NAFTA highway. These are real things. It's not somebody made these up. It's not a conspiracy. They don't talk about it, and they might not admit about it, but there's been money spent on it. There was legislation passed in the Texas legislature unanimously to put a hold on it. They're planning on millions of acres taken by eminent domain for an international highway from Mexico to Canada, which is going to make the immigration problem that much worse. So it's not so much a secretive conspiracy. It's a contest between ideologies, whether we believe in our institutions here, our national sovereignty, our Constitution, or are we going to further move in the direction of international government, more UN? You know, this country goes to war under UN resolutions. I don't like big government in Washington. So I don't like this trend toward international government. We have a WTO that wants to control our drug industry, our nutritional products. So I'm against all that, but it's not so much as a sinister conspiracy. It's just knowledge is out there. If we look for it, you'll realize that our national sovereignty is under threat.
Congressman Paul, thank you.
I have one final question. Senator Mitch McConnell said his one goal in life is to make sure that Barack Obama is a one-term president. Would you approve of that? And do you think that it is good to put your party politics above the country?
I don't know whether those are the choices, but if I'm running for the nomination to run against Obama, how would I be able to say?
Do you think that?
How would I be able to say that?
If you were elected and a Democratic senator stood up and said, essentially, I'm going to obstruct everything because my goal is to make sure you're a one-term president. Yeah. I don't care what happens to the country. Do you think that's appropriate? I
would be tested to overcome that type of an attitude by building coalitions and talking to everybody, because I can talk to everybody across the political spectrum.
But is it appropriate?
I wouldn't talk like that. You know, matter of fact, there are other candidates even on our side. That's what they dwell on. But as much as I dislike the Federal Reserve, I don't dwell on Bernanke, and I don't dwell on the president. I mean, if you ask me, you know, I usually say, well, I don't think he's done a very good job. But I see it philosophically that people have certain ideas that as long as they believe these ideas people in government will react in that manner. As long as the people endorse the idea that they're to be taken care of and we're supposed to be the policemen of the world, and printing money is a good idea, can't do anything about it. So it isn't Bernanke. To me, it's a system. It's understanding monetary policy. It isn't Obama, and it isn't George Bush. It's a system. So it isn't Bernanke. To me, it's a system. It's understanding monetary policy. It isn't Obama, and it isn't George Bush. It's a system.
Barack is like the manager of Burger King. All presidents are, including Bush. It's like this: when your fries are cold, if your burger is not done right, you go back to Burger King, America, or your government, and you say, "My burger's cold. I want new fries." First, you go to the cashier. That's the courts. You argue to the courts. The courts, if you can't get no justice with the cashier, you say, "Let me see the manager. I want to go to the Supreme Court. I want to see the president." The manager comes out. "Hi, what can I do for you?" Now the manager can override the decisions of the cashier, but you never get to see the franchise owner of Burger King. If you really have a problem with your burger, you need to go see the franchise owner. We need to go to the top or to the bottom. We need to go to where the real architecture of government is, and it's not in a president. It's in a global scheme.
So it isn't Bernanke. To me, it's a system. It's understanding monetary policy. It isn't Obama, and it isn't George Bush. It's a system. So it isn't Bernanke. To me, it's a system. It's understanding monetary policy. It isn't Obama, and it isn't George Bush. It's a system on foreign policy. It's been around a long time. You know, it's a foreign policy of intervention that I.
Did you hear about that recent Bilderberg group meeting in what was it, Shantyville, Virginia?
Yeah, recently there was one, and there were some reports on it. I didn't read a whole lot about it, but
Man.
certainly we're there.
What do you think they're doing there? Seriously, what do you think they're doing there?
Well, they probably get together and talk about how they're going to control the banking systems of the world and natural resources. And we get together and we talk about how we're going to get our freedom back. So we have our own things to talk about.
Barack Obama's been given a pass by the blue bloods. He's been given the okay by certain secret societies for them to let him in. I truly believe imperialism and fascism needs a facelift. And that facelift is going to have to be black. And the reason why I believe that, simply because I think they're trying to go into Africa. Well, they're already in Africa, but they want to totally control all the natural minerals that they're going to need to carry themselves into the 21st, 22nd, and 23rd centuries. You follow me? So I think they have to go through a phase of galvanizing the masses of dark-skinned people that truly believe that change needs to come, but the change that they're talking about is not necessarily change for the better as far as the masses of the people. It's probably a better change for them. It's not going to change for us, the little man on the totem pole. And no one looks at the agenda. As long as he positions himself right, have the right tie on, have the right smile, repeats the slogans over and over and drives it home, the average American is just going to swallow it hook, line, and sinker. And we don't even know what the agenda is. Now, a lot of times, we don't want to know the issue. Right. We don't want to know the issue. We feel, what do you call this thing where you get this false sense of gratification, but because a black man is in office, everything's going to be all right. No, everything's not going to be all right. Yeah. Until you look into the agenda on what the Democratic Party has been about, is about, and will be about, regardless if Barack Obama is the president or not.
Listen to me now while I rap and sing. For the New World Order, just put on a black face. Americans, you are in the process of globalization. You are in the process of a New World Order. Just because it has a black face don't mean a thing. about the people. The people. The people. I, more than anybody, am ecstatic over the fact that at least the racial barrier in the White House has been broken. But now let's get down with the truth. The truth. After we leave the emotionalism alone for a minute, what do we as Americans should be looking out for? How should we be getting prepared for what's about to come? Just because we have an African American president doesn't mean that he's not going to continue the Bush agenda. I'm not dissing anybody, but a politician is a politician. And if I can say one thing to all people in the United States, it's this: America has broken its own rules, has broken its own laws. It's time for the citizenry of the United States to actually follow its own laws. If we stay steadfast to the Constitution, at least, we won't be hit so hard with that global agenda. Here's what we were talking about the other day. If you really want to see what black governance is like, take a look at the mayors of major cities. When the cities were in power, we couldn't be the mayors. It's when the cities lost power, they put in black mayors. When the states had power, we couldn't be governors. But then when the states lose power, we got senators, governors, African-American senators and governors. Now the nation has lost power. The dollar has lost power. The world is global. Now you can get a black president because it doesn't matter. It's global now. So the real issue is this: are you going to allow this system to tempt you into their prisons, into their job, into their psyche? Follow your purpose. This is what will defeat it all. If you're on your purpose, even death respects purpose. But if my president frees Mumia Abu-Jamal, maybe he'll get my eye up. If my president could release political prisoners, maybe my eye will go up. If my president can stop ignoring police misconduct, maybe my eye will go up. But I'm not hopeful. But I know what the truth is. The truth come out of anybody's mouth. The truth don't have no color. The truth is that people are hurting. The truth is that they trying to turn us into China. The truth is we're in so much debt that the only way out is revolution or war. So now the question is, what side are you on?
The next question will be asked by Cynthia Tucker, answered first by Congressman Tancredo. Cynthia.
Congressman, recently a push to give the District of Columbia voting representation was defeated because of heavy Republican opposition. In addition, many voting rights advocates are worried about rigid voter ID laws, which require a photo ID like a driver's license. Are you concerned that some eligible voters will be denied the right to vote simply because they don't have a driver's license?
It's very clear under the Constitution that we couldn't give the vote to the residents of D.C. without an amendment to the Constitution, and it should be pursued in that manner. But when it comes to national ID cards, I mean, the identification, I think the states have the prerogative and the right and the obligations to identify the voters, and they should. But the reason I get worried about it when we start talking about it nationally is, you know, they might want to use the real ID. They might want to think it's a good excuse to have a national ID card to vote, and I am positively opposed to any move toward the national ID.
Is there a plan for a new world order, a one world government, and how do we stop it?
Well, I think even our first President Bush said that the New World Order was in tune, and that's what they were working for. The UN is part of that government. They're working right now very significantly for a North American Union. That's why there's a lot of people in Washington that don't care too much about our borders. They have a philosophical belief that national sovereignty is not important. It's also the reason I have made very strong suggestion that we need not be in the United Nations for our national security.
The election process will become the task of world government monitors. The U.S. Congress, President, judicial system, and state and local government shall exist only as a facade to assure American citizens that they still have a voice in government. Checks and balances among branches of government will be eliminated. The states will become mere subdivisions of the national government, just as the national government will become a subdivision of the world government. The Bill of Rights portion of the U.S. Constitution will be superseded by the UN Convention on Civil and Political Rights. The U.S. Constitution will be supplanted by the UN Charter and consigned to the ash heap of history, a useless relic of the past.
I believe those individuals in this country, and there are plenty, who believe that we should have the right to own and bear arms, ought to be concerned with what's happening in the United Nations, because they are a threat to us. They would confiscate our guns. There have been proposals made at some of their conventions where they would literally repeal the Second Amendment. And I think that everybody should be alert to this and realize that this is not just fun and games, and this is just not a discussion club that we're dealing with. Individuals who believe in the right to own property ought to be concerned. Americans believe in that. They're careless about it. Sometimes they allow our governments to regulate too much and to tax us too much. But really, the right of private property ownership is severely threatened by our own government. But it's going to be a lot worse if the United Nations gets involved. There is no way that you can have the concept of private property right. They believe in welfare redistribution, socialist redistribution, that everybody owns everything, and they would take from the wealthy and give to the poor to get an equal balance. Same old story that we've heard for years, but they do not protect the right to own private property by anything promoted by the United Nations. If United Nations has their way, there will be curtailment of our right to practice religion. They are not going to be believers in the right to practice our religions as we have seen fit throughout this country, and therefore those individuals who are interested in this subject certainly cannot be complacent about what the United Nations is doing.
Get us out of the UN. March 20th, 1997, Capitol Hill. Texas U.S. Representative Ron Paul introduces one of the most crucial bills regarding the future of freedom, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act. Its purpose, to provide for complete withdrawal of the United States from the United Nations.
Well, I don't think we need the United Nations to be able to talk to other nations. The United Nations was established in 1945. We talked to a lot of nations before that. We have our embassies, we have our ambassadors, we can pick up a telephone these days and talk to whoever we want around the world. So I do not think that is a legitimate excuse. That is just an excuse to do the bad things that the United Nations does. Every year since we belonged to the United Nations, we have lost a little bit of our sovereignty. And we're moving in that direction where eventually we will not have the United States of America and will be nothing more than a pawn of the United Nations.
It didn't take long for word to get out. Soon, Dr. Paul's office received messages from other representatives willing to co-sponsor the bill, and an avalanche of congratulatory letters from the American people thanking him for introducing this crucial bill covered his desk. June 4th, 1997, 54 representatives vote in favor of the Get Us Out measure. A few years ago, it was unlikely if 4 representatives would have supported it. Even though the measure didn't pass, the numbers are a solid indicator of the accelerated support for the United States' immediate withdrawal from the UN. And with the help of more and more Americans, Congress will again be forced to vote whether or not to get us out of the United Nations for good.
The Congress tends to be political at times. They tend to respond to what they hear, and they think there's enough people in their district that want them to vote a certain way, they all of a sudden will become interested. The American people are starting to wake up. I think we're making a lot of progress, and I predict we're going to get a lot more votes next time.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to urge the leadership of this body to bring a very important vote to the House floor. I recently introduced H.R. 1146, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act, which would end our participation in the United Nations. Millions of Americans have begun to question why we continue to spend $300 million each year funding and housing an organization that is actively hostile to American interests. Surely Congress, which routinely spends 15 minutes renaming post offices, can spare 15 minutes to vote on this fundamental issue of American sovereignty. Obviously, many Americans now want to get out of the UN because they resent its refusal to sanction our war in Iraq. The administration deserves some credit for ultimately upholding the principle that American national sovereignty is not a matter of international consensus and that we don't need UN authorization to act. But the administration sent mixed signals by doing everything possible to obtain such authorization and by citing UN resolutions as justification for our actions. The message seems to be that the United Nations is credible when we control it and it does what we want, but lacks all credibility when it refuses to do our bidding. Perhaps it's time to stop trying to manipulate the United Nations and start asserting our national sovereignty. If we do not, rest assured that the United Nations will continue to interfere not only in our foreign policy, but in our domestic policies as well. UN globalists are not satisfied by meddling only in international disputes. They increasingly want to influence our domestic, environmental, trade, labor, tax, and gun laws. UN global planners fully intend to expand the organization into a true world government, complete with taxes, courts, and possibly a standing army. This is not an alarmist statement. These goals are readily promoted on the UN's own website. UN planners do not care about national sovereignty. In fact, they are openly hostile toward it. They correctly view it as an obstacle to their plans. They simply aren't interested in our Constitution and Republican form of government. The choice is very clear. We either follow the Constitution or submit to UN global governance. American national sovereignty cannot survive if we allow our domestic laws to be crafted or even influenced by an international body. This needs to be stated publicly more often. If we continue down the UN path, America as we know it will cease to exist. Noted constitutional scholar Herb Titus has thoroughly researched the United Nations and its purported authority. Titus explains that the UN Charter is not a treaty at all, but rather a blueprint for a supranational government that directly violates the Constitution. As such, the Charter is neither politically nor legally binding upon the American people or government. The UN has no authority to make laws that bind American citizens because it does not derive its powers from the consent of the American people. We need to stop speaking of UN resolutions and edicts as if they represented legitimate laws or treaties. They do not. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I'm merely asking House leadership to schedule a vote on H.R. 1146, the American National Sovereignty Act. Americans deserve to know how their representative stands on the critical issue of American sovereignty. And I yield back the balance of my time. I rise as a member of the International Relations Committee, but I would like to express my disappointment that of my amendments that were offered to the Rules Committee, none of them were approved. So that was a great disappointment to me. I will vote for the rule, recognizing the fact that it is hard to accommodate everyone, but nevertheless, it is very clear that I have been an outspoken opponent of the United Nations, and the amendments that we will be discussing will really not deal with the essence of whether or not we should be involved as we are. I think we're tinkering on the edges and will not do much to improve the bill, even if some of the amendments get passed, which I will support. But I do think there's some serious things that we must consider. One is the issue of national sovereignty. To support H.R. 1646, you have to give up some of our national sovereignty to the United Nations. There's $844 million for peacekeeping missions. We know now that we live in an age when we go to war, not by declaration of the U.S. Congress, but we go to war under UN resolutions. When we vote for this bill, and if you support this bill, you support that concept of giving up our sovereignty and going to war under UN resolutions. I would have liked to struck all the money for population control. I will support the Mexican City language, but it really doesn't do that much. All funds are fungible, and if we provide hundreds of millions of dollars for population control and say, please don't use it for abortion, you just shift the funds around. So there is no real attack on the use of American taxpayers' money for abortion if we don't strike all these funds. The United Nations have already laid plans for an international tax. This January it was proposed. They would like to put a tax on all currency transactions to raise $1.5 billion. This is abhorrent. This should be abhorrent to all of us. It should be abhorrent to all Americans that we would have an international tax imposed by the United Nations. Already the United Nations is involved in tax collecting. In Bosnia right now, in Serbia, the UN, one of their functions is to collect taxes on goods coming into the country. There was a demonstration not too long ago by the Serbs objecting to this. The idea that UN soldiers paid by American taxpayers that are now tax collectors in Bosnia should arouse our concern. The only way, since we do not have the amendments to reject some of this funding, the only way we who believe that our sovereignty is being challenged is to reject 1646. I see no other way to address this subject because it is not in our best interest to go along with this. The way the bill is written right now, we will support the Kyoto Treaty. And the International Criminal Court is also something that we should be contending with.
The other thing that bothers me about going into war, not only is it without constitutional declaration, but we go in inevitably under the UN. I mean, even in this war, we went in to enforce UN resolution. So I would say the proper position that we should have for the UN is there's no need to be in the UN. Why don't we just get out? Nation that protected liberty here at home and yet traded with people and traveled and were friends with everybody, we still would not need the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, the NAFTA or NAFTA for the New World Order.
And if I could say one thing to all people in the United States, it's this. America has broken its own rules, has broken its own laws. It's time for the citizenry of the United States to actually follow its own laws. If we stay steadfast to the Constitution at least, we won't be hit so hard with that global agenda.
You talk about freedom and tyranny. I seldom hear politicians use those words.
That's right. I think those are our only two choices, and we've had a grand experiment in this country where we emphasize freedom. If you read the Constitution was designed to protect individual liberty, to restrain the government. But we have forgotten that. Now we have an interpretation which means that we spy on the American people, encroach on their privacy, take care of them, run the nanny state, and then we have secrecy in government. So we have it now reversed. People say, well, they'll criticize me and say, oh, Ron, you want to go back to the dark ages, back to the dark ages of the strict interpretation of the Constitution. Well, I want to go back to the Constitution, but I don't consider it the dark ages. I think the dark ages were the days when all you had was tyranny. So freedom is new, tyranny is old, it's ancient.
Well, here it is. This isn't the Dark Ages. This is the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. We don't need 55,000 pages of tax code alone and its explanations. This is enough. Everything is in here.
Fantastic, isn't it? Truth is simple. It is not complex. And people ask me, how do I explain what I'm talking about? And I say, freedom is popular. And it is not complex. The more complex it is, the more leery we ought to be of what they're doing. You know, when they come across and they say, aha, we have to solve the problems of 9/11, we'll pass the Patriot Act. Well, that's complex. 400 pages, and they dump it on us an hour before we vote. You can read the Constitution, you understand it, but you cannot read and understand hardly any of the legislation being passed.
And win or lose, are you having a good time educating people about the Constitution?
I think the most fun is probably the fact that there's a greater number of people than I ever dreamed that still remember the Constitution, and they were waiting for somebody to speak in defense of the Constitution. But the other almost miraculous thing is happening. The young people are responding, and they come in. And when I ask them, why do you join the campaign? And I'll say, we love your position on the Constitution. We love your position on freedom. These are young people who understand. It's not like they don't understand what they're inheriting. They know something about Social Security, and they know something about intrusion of personal liberties and personal choices. That, to me, is a lot of fun.
So you mentioned the Constitution a couple of times. You, of course, are one of those well, there are a few like you in the government in the U.S. who have the level of experience you do. Based on what you've seen, how things have changed, do you feel the Constitution, the American Constitution, has remained intact? Is it serving its purpose?
No, not really. Most members of Congress believe they do their very best. They just interpret it differently, because we've had quite a few generations now teach our young people that interpreting the Constitution is flexible. It should be modernized. They don't say amend it if you want to change it. They say, well, you can interpret certain provisions of the Constitution differently, and therefore you do have the authority. Some even argue that if the Constitution doesn't prohibit something, you're allowed to do it, and that's not the way it's written. The Constitution is written explicitly to say you can't do anything, that is the U.S. government, unless the Constitution gives you direct authority to do it. So they misinterpret it, and they don't lose any sleep over it. So once again, it's an educational effort to understand what our system is all about and why limited government and following the rule of law is so important.
Because liberty is my most important issue. My goal in life is to do whatever I can to preserve that entity called liberty, which is what I believe made this country great, because we had been given the maximum amount of liberty of any country before. And believe me, I think if we would have followed the direction of our Constitution and protected our liberties, we'd be a lot better off today. But when you think about defending liberty, we can look to our Constitution. It's pretty darn good. But you know, I've actually decided that the document itself is secondary. It's good to have a document. We should have the rule of law, and we should be very keen on following the rule of law. But we have a document called the Constitution. Everybody goes to Congress. Everybody takes the same oath. And it seems like nobody knows what they're doing. You know, everybody takes the same oath. And it's strange. Most of them believe they're following the Constitution. You know, today, you know, with the new Congress, there's a new rule that anytime you pass a law today, anytime you introduce legislation, you have to cite the portion of the Constitution that you get the authority to do what you're doing. But it doesn't help. You know, they cite the General Welfare Clause. Oh, we can do anything we want under the General Welfare Clause. Oh, the Interstate Commerce Clause. What have they been doing with that? The Interstate Commerce, anything you want. And then they'll cite the end of Article 1, Section 8. They list the things we're allowed to do. They don't pay a lot of attention to that, but at the end it says you can write any law necessary and proper to enforce Article 1, Section 8.
But no, they dissect that out and they say, well, we're writing this law because it's necessary and proper to do so. So the Constitution hasn't restrained people from doing what we've ended up with. We go to war without declaration. We have a welfare state that's not authorized in the Constitution. We have a monetary system that disobeys flagrantly, you know, the Constitution. So it hasn't worked. And I think it was Adams that said that, you know, it won't work unless you have a moral people. And if you have an immoral people who will send individuals to Washington and they're tolerated to not follow the laws, the Constitution won't do us any good. But I think we've reached this point. But what I see happening right now is a growing number of people that are concerned are starting to say, we've had enough and we should have a different approach, and we can't let people go along and say the Constitution is a breathing, living document and we have to adapt it, but don't bother to amend it. Just do whatever you want and justify it because it's so necessary and we don't have time to amend the Constitution. I think about the war issue especially. On the constitutional issue. That's something I've worked on for so many years, of saying, no, there's too many, and why are we doing this? I mean, I was aware of World War II. I was aware of the Korean War. Teachers left our school and didn't come back, and then there was the Vietnam War, and then during that decade I was in the service. I didn't go to Vietnam. And Korea was undeclared, Vietnam was undeclared, and we fight wars constantly. And who starts the wars? I mean, where's the authority come from? Where's it supposed to come from? It's supposed to come from the people through their Congress, and there's supposed to be a vote for a declaration of war. And I didn't like what happened in Vietnam. I ended up being in Congress when we were getting ready to go into Iraq. And it was very important to me that I do what I could to hold the Congress accountable. So I was on the International Relations Committee, as I am now, and they were debating this resolution to give the authority to the President to do this. So I introduced a resolution to declare war in the committee. And I said that I'm not going to vote for the war, but we should, if you want to go to war, you should declare the war. Get everybody behind the war, and we'll all come together, the people behind it, and get it over with. And, of course, nobody voted for it. And they said, and the chairman of the committee at that time said that, he says, Congressman Paul, he says, you should ignore that because that part of the Constitution is an anachronism. We don't follow that anymore. And I got to thinking, well, that's about the way they look at the whole Constitution. Maybe the gold and silver legal tender provision. It's an anachronism. We don't follow, and that's for sure. So it is the lack of respect for the rule of law and sending people there that either don't understand what the Constitution is supposed to mean, or they don't have the character to follow it. And we've ended up with a mess. We've ended up with constant war and constant escalating expansion of the welfare state, and we're flat out broke.
Thank you. Congressman Paul, you call your campaign a revolution, and I think it's safe to say that your brand of change is one of the most sweeping proposed by any candidate of either party, but getting your agenda through Congress would likely require a revolution of an entirely different sort. So how would you adjust your plan in light of political reality in Washington?
Well, the secret is the term revolution wasn't my word, and it didn't come up on our webpage. It was coined by the supporters. But in a way, it is revolutionary to go back to the Constitution. And we'd like to continue the old revolution. And believe me, freedom is unifying. We bring a lot of people together. People then are free to choose what they would like to do with their lives, free to choose how they would spend their money. And all of a sudden, we wouldn't be telling other countries how to live. So this brings people together. And I think it's appealing to both left and right and middle. And our campaign really has that appeal. So therefore, we would bring the Congress together.
The president asks a very important question, and we should all come together, and we shouldn't have that many disagreements because we should be bound down by the Constitution. But the people in this country think we live in an age of relative ethics, is what they kind of come to the conclusion of. Sure, profess to believe in the Constitution, but why have we gone to war since World War II without a declaration of war? Why do we have a monetary system that is not designed by the Constitution? Why do we have a welfare state running out of control, not designed by the Constitution? You can't pay lip service to the Constitution without obeying it. And we should have peace and prosperity. That should be our goal. We in foreign policy ought to have a golden rule. We ought to treat others as we would want others to treat us, and we don't treat others so fairly. We treat them like we're the bully, that we're the policeman of the world, and we're going to tell them to behave. If they don't listen to us, we bomb them. If they listen to us, we give them more money, and it's bankrupting this country because we don't live up to our principles. The principles are embedded in our Constitution.
Dr. Paul, I'd like to begin with you. Every debate begins with a specific policy question, but this is a little different. Someone on this stage hopes to be able to take the oath of office 14 months from now, and at the end of that oath are the words, "So help me God." When you hear those 4 words, if you have the opportunity and the privilege to say them, what will come to mind?
Well, I think they're very important. We take, those of us who have been in Congress and served in government, we take an oath frequently. We take an oath to uphold the Constitution. And that's what we do when we take an oath when we're sworn in as president. We emphasize this. But I think what that does, it emphasizes it even more so because of the significance and the importance. And it reiterates the fact that we swear to uphold the Constitution and the rule of law. And to me, this would mean that you're not only saying this, in front of a small number of people, not only in front of the nation, but before our God, which means the significance is that much greater. So those of us who have done this before, and I've taken my oath rather seriously, very seriously, and believe that I've done a very good job in upholding the Constitution, and even when sometimes it's difficult. And this to me would send the signal that by saying, "So help me God," I really will obey the Constitution and that pledge.
And if I could say one thing to all people in the United States, it's this: America has broken its own rules, has broken its own laws. It's time for the citizenry of the United States to actually follow its own laws. If we stay steadfast to the Constitution, at least we won't be hit so hard with that global agenda.
Going, and again, thanks for coming. The federal government now has a lot of control over education, healthcare, transportation, energy, banking, our financial institutions. If you were president, what would you begin to downsize, eliminate, redirect to states? What are the programs at the federal level that we need to get out of the federal government?
Well, that's a difficult question because that's a long list. I'd rather you give me the list of one of the things we should keep. Yeah. That would be a short list.
Well, let's flip it around then. What should the federal government be doing?
Well, we should have a system of sound money and property rights and contracts. We should have a judicial system. We should have a government and a defense of this country. That was not meant to be for the states, but not a heck of a lot else. We weren't supposed to have 100,000 federal bureaucrats who carry guns. People are supposed to carry the guns, not the bureaucrats. So, no, I think everything should be up for grabs, and it should be grossly reduced. And both parties have added departments endlessly for the last 5, 6, 7 decades. And that's why freedom is not the issue anymore. It's tyranny, it's big government, and we're trying to struggle to hang on to this. But I think we're in a desperate state of affairs because it's slipping by, and with the economy in shambles like we have today, I think we're in much bigger trouble than a lot of people realize.
Bad business deal.
I want to move on and hear the free statements from our next 2 candidates. Congressman Paul first, and then Senator Thompson.
The goal of all political action should be to preserve liberty. We need more freedom in this country. We need to look to ourselves and what we are doing. We have drifted so far from our Constitution that the Constitution was written to restrain our government. Yet we've turned around and the Constitution now is used to restrain the people. But we have no chance if we don't restrain the government, all that they do in undermining our personal liberties, controlling our economic well-being, and using it as an excuse to police the world. If we don't change the role for government, this country is going to suffer a very, very serious economic crisis.
Freedom of choice, says presidential candidate Ron Paul, shouldn't just be restricted to choices he approves of. He opposes things like prostitution and drug use, but says the federal government has no business trying to stop adults from doing them. You would legalize marijuana, cocaine, heroin?
I would get the government out of regulating all those substances, and I would allow the states to deal with problems, whether children should have them, whether children can buy cigarettes and alcohol or hard drugs, marijuana, and different states would probably do different things. The first federal law against marijuana was 1938, and they did it through high taxation because they knew they didn't have authority to say that you're not allowed to smoke marijuana. Today, it's gone berserk. The federal government comes in and overrules a state that has legalized marijuana to be used for very sick people, AIDS and cancer, and they're getting some help. The federal government comes in, puts people in prison that are sick because they're using it for medical reasons, and they've never committed a violent crime. That's how absurd the war on drugs has become.
Alcohol prohibition led to more crime. You argue that even heroin could be legal if some state decided? Wouldn't?
I think under our system of government that would be the case. But if you ask the people who are against it, if a state did that, would you use it? They say, oh no, I wouldn't use it. It's always those other people that might use it, so I have to take care of them and prevent them from doing harm to themselves.
What about that? Is that a role for government?
No, I don't believe so. I think the government's role should not be involved in personal habits. I believe those rules should protect children who are below the age of making good judgments. So I have no problem with state laws that would protect children from the use of these drugs. But under the Constitution, the president and the federal government wouldn't have a say in it.
What should government do?
Protect our freedoms, have a strong national defense, look and take care of our borders, have a sound currency. So we want to have a protection of the general welfare, the general environment of free markets and ability to trade with each other and travel among the states. That was the responsibility of the federal government, not to run our lives and run everything in the economy and extend, the Interstate Commerce Clause and the General Welfare Clause to do anything they want to do. That is what has happened.
So keep the peace. So defense, the military, police forces, enforce contracts, and that's about it?
That's it. We would have a court system to enforce contracts, and when people do harm to others, when they do harm, taking property or injuring somebody, or polluting a neighbor's air. I think there's a role for government to protect our environment through private property rights. I mean, I think that, if we live on a river, I happen to have a house on a river, I don't want somebody upstream dumping their pollution in that river, and I should have a right of recourse. And
so keep us safe, enforce contracts, run the courts, pollution rules, and otherwise butt out, leave us alone?
Basically that, which would be meaning if we get back to that, and I'm elected, I should immediately take a pay cut, because I wouldn't have so much to do.
Who's going to do it if you politicians don't do it?
That's what some people wondered. But, I think what's happened, though, is the failure of government is becoming more evident than ever before, especially in this country. The failure of taking care of the victims of Katrina, the failure of the war, the bankruptcy of the Social Security system. The government hasn't protected us from lead in paints, on and on. It just goes on.
Is the answer more government, more protection?
Some people are arguing that, and of course I take the position that government interferes too often. We become complacent and depend on the government to protect us, and they fail, and they don't provide the services that they claim. You know, we've had the government involved in our medical care system since the early 70s. We've had managed care, and all of a sudden nobody's happy with it. So now the choice is, did we have too much government, or do we need, you know, a single payer? Should we move toward a socialized system, or should we look to the marketplace to help us sort out the problems we have in medicine? My argument, of course, is always looking for the answers in the free market, in private choices, and individuals dealing with those problems, rather than depending on the state, which generally will support maybe the special interest.
So you want to get rid of a lot of the government. This is Department of Education, one of the big, beautiful buildings in Washington. You get rid of it? We don't need this?
Yes, just think of what kind of businessman might be able to make good use of that piece of property.
But
no,
how
we
do
don't
people
need
get
it.
educated?
We might get better education. The evidence shows since the 1950s, since the federal government's gotten involved, the quality of education has gone down and the cost has gone up. So
federal government should have no role?
There's no authority for it, and they've proved themselves inefficient. The one city they're totally in charge of is Washington, D.C., $13,000 a year per student. They have more guns, more drugs, more violence. A bad educational system. So there's no evidence that the government can do a very good job.
Department of Energy.
No, we don't need a Department of Energy.
How will we get energy?
The market will do it. Supply and
This is
demand.
just unnecessary?
Oh yeah, there's no need. That serves the interest of big business. So if government needs an energy policy, what they're saying is, how do we take taxpayers' money and put the money in R&D, and which big company is going to get the largesse from the government? That's the kind of thing that encourages.
What's wrong with that? The wise elites in Washington will pick the best investment.
Well, it might end up that the subsidies might go to producing ethanol from corn, and it might turn out
it is going there.
It might turn out it wasn't the best investment. You know, maybe it cost too much to make the ethanol, but somebody made some profits off it.
Other cabinet departments: Department of Agriculture, Commerce, Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development. You'd get rid of all of them?
Yeah, of course, that's not on the immediate agenda, but in theory, they're unnecessary, and we should think about what kind of a country we would have without these departments. And I think we would have a better country, and all those problems that they're supposed to solve, I think, would be lessened.
Commerce Department? We don't need the Commerce Department to have commerce?
No, absolutely not.
Homeland Security, isn't that a role for the federal government?
Not really, not the way that's designed. That's the biggest bureaucracy of them all. There's some parts of that department that are okay. You know, they put the Coast Guard in there, and they put FEMA in there, and everybody's bunched together. No, Homeland Security, how's it been taken care of for all these years? Pretty well. And I think it was failure of government on 9/11, not the fact that we didn't have the Department of Homeland Security, and we didn't have a national ID card, and we didn't have this constant surveillance and loss of our privacy. That's
failure of government how?
We spent $40 billion on intelligence gathering and didn't prevent it from happening. But the government was in charge of the airlines, FAA. They were supposed to inspect the people as they went on. You weren't supposed to resist any hostage takeovers, and they weren't allowed to have a gun. Maybe if you and I had the airlines, we might have said, hey, you know, we want to protect our passengers. Maybe we should have a stronger door on there. Maybe we ought to give our pilots a gun. So it wouldn't have happened. 9/11 wouldn't have happened.
So government creates the wrong rules, too many rules and the wrong ones?
That's basically it, and most of the time, well-intentioned, but good intentions will not solve our problems.
You anger libertarians when you vote against NAFTA, GATT, CAFTA trade agreements. You're too much of an idealistic candidate, they say. I mean, these agreements make trade more possible, so what if they're hundreds of pages?
No, I don't think it always does. It's more government, and it serves special interests. We go to the WTO more to get retaliation against those who we think are cheating. Then we go to get lower tariffs. The lower tariffs part, you could do it without more government, so I'm all for the lower tariffs. But, you know, everybody's idealistic. Some people are more idealistic in depending on international government. I'm idealistic in thinking that these problems can be solved with a lot less government.
Congressman Ron Paul has been called Dr. No because he repeatedly votes against legislation that he believes gives government too much power. If it's not in the Constitution, he says, the federal government has no business doing it. He even votes against laws that would give money to his constituents. Your district is subject to floods, but you vote against FEMA. Why?
Because I think FEMA helps create the flood problems. You know, if it's risky on the Gulf Coast to build there, the insurance prices will go up. Then you can either build there or pay high fees. But if it's too high, nobody will build there. Or they'll build there with full risk. If flood comes or the wind blows your house away, you don't get reimbursed. So there might be modest building in those areas. But if the government subsidizes the insurance and say, oh, if you build there, don't sweat it. We're going to bail you out. So all of a sudden, more people move into the flood-prone areas. And then who are the people that have to bail you out? Somebody that lives out in the desert someplace. So it's unfair. It's not good economics. You create more problems. More houses get flooded, and it becomes a general problem rather than an individual problem. And what we have undermined there is the principle of measuring risk. And then people do things that they wouldn't have otherwise done.
Like move to the edge of the ocean.
That is right.
You also say no farm subsidies. None.
No, first off, I can't quite find it in the Constitution that said, you know, the farm subsidies program is authorized by Article 1, Section 8. It's not there.
Economically, do we need farm subsidies to make sure we have food?
I think it is totally unnecessary. I think we might push the prices of food up and maybe makes it more difficult for poor people to buy food. Because if there's a subsidy, it means the taxpayer was taxed to pay the subsidy to the so-called family farmer, which usually doesn't get the money. It usually goes to a huge corporate farmer. So the taxpayer pays one time, then when you go to the store, you pay higher prices for your food. So it hasn't helped the people. And why should we assume that the farmers wouldn't be productive? They're hardworking people. And I never voted for farm subsidies, and I represented a farm district, and the farmers voted for that. They voted for me, but the farm organizations don't. You know, medical organizations don't particularly send money to me either. The doctors will. The farmers will support me, but not the organizations. When you have these organizations, whether they're farm organizations or medical organizations, they seem to get too close to government, and they sort of wheel and deal with the government and sort of justify their existence as lobbyists. And I don't think they really truly represents the grassroots of these organizations.
And most crops don't have subsidies. We have plenty of peaches and plums.
That's right.
Peas.
And sometimes when I go to the grocery store, I always marvel, isn't it wonderful how we can go and see so much fresh produce there? And the prices aren't regulated for these other things. It was a fallacious argument back in the 30s that the Depression came from free markets, and therefore we had to protect everybody, and we had to have a safety net for everybody, and we had a safety net for the farmers, and we gave up on believing in freedom and understanding how the market works.
Paul, I want to show you the video that got the most votes of all the video questions submitted to YouTube, and this one comes, as you can see, from Brandy and Michael in Spencer, Indiana.
There's growing concern among Americans about the size and the scope of the federal government and its infringement upon state and individual rights.
If you're elected president, how do you plan to restore the 10th Amendment, hold the federal government only to those enumerated powers in the Constitution, and allow states to govern themselves?
Congressman, what's your answer for Brandy and Michael?
Well, obviously it would take more than one individual, but the responsibility of the president would be to veto every single bill that violates the 10th Amendment. That would be the solution.
Anything else there? You got a little time left.
Well, I'll tell you what, that is the subject that is crucial because government is too big in Washington, D.C. It's run away. We have no controls of spending, taxes, regulations, no control on the Federal Reserve printing money. So if we want government, whether it's medical care or whatever, it's proper to do it at the local level as well as our schools. But there is no authority in the Constitution to do so much of what we're doing. There's no authority for them to run our schools, no authority to control our economy, and no authority to control us as individuals on what we do with our personal lives.
Over to Congressman Paul. You're known as the absolutist in the bunch, someone who has consistently opposed federal government from having any role, and I think by your definition that isn't explicitly laid out in the Constitution. So this makes people curious. Is there a line with you? Where do you draw it? Does this include things like making cars safe, making medicine safe, air traffic control, controlling the jets above our heads?
Well, I think in theory, if you understood the free market and a free society, you don't need government to do that. And we live in a society where we have been adapted to this, and you can't just drop it all at once, but you can transition away from it. On regulations, no, I don't believe in any of these federal regulations, but that doesn't mean I don't believe in regulations. The regulation of the marketplace takes care of it. Just think if we had the regulations on the market that dealt with the bankruptcies, that had to go bankrupt. We wouldn't have been able to bail out the big banks and the big corporations and dump on the poor people. Well, so the market would dictate it. You can't commit fraud. If you need detailed regulations, you can do it at the state level, but the federal government is not authorized to nitpick every little transaction. The way they use the interstate commerce clause is outrageous as far as I'm concerned.
Well, 30 seconds more for devil's advocate here, because would you then put it on the drug companies to say, no, we're bringing this to market, trust us, it's a fantastic drug. All the pilots in the sky to add to their responsibilities, their own air traffic control in an organic way.
What I said is theoretically it could be privatized, but who ends up doing the regulations on the drugs? They do as much harm as good. They don't take good care of us. Who gets to write the regulations? The bureaucrats write the regulations, but who writes the laws? The lobbyists have control. So the lobbyists from the drug industry has control of writing the regulations, so you turn it over to the bureaucracy, but you would have private institutions that could become credible. And I mean, do we need the federal government to tell us whether we buy a safe car? I say the consumers of America are smart enough to decide what kind of car they can buy and whether it's safe or not, and they don't need federal government hounding them and putting so much regulations on that our car industry has gone overseas.
But then when it comes to drinking raw milk, you have to have the government tell you whether or not you can drink raw milk. And whatnot, or what you smoke and drink and what the whole works. Anything that goes into a mouth is up for grabs at all levels of government. They think they can tell us. And I say no. And these habits, whether they're eating habits or smoking habits or whatever, these problems can be solved with private property rights, with, like allowing restaurants to make their own rules, rather than coming in and closing people down and saying, oh, somebody lit a cigarette here the other day, you're closing us down, and, all of that. And I don't like, obviously, the cigarettes, and I don't like the drugs or anything. But I'll tell you what. As bad as I don't like those drugs, I really don't like the drug war. I think it's much more dangerous. A lot more people have died in the drug wars than they die from the drugs. Matter of fact, more people die from prescription drugs than they do from the illegal drugs. So they're not doing very much good by having the drugs legalized either. But we have a tremendous task ahead of us, and we don't have the same attitude that we had when they wanted to make alcohol illegal. That's pretty good. They worked for 50, 60, 70 years to get the country to agree that alcohol was bad stuff, and I agree with them. Alcohol is bad. So they come along and they say, well, we're going to prohibit it because we're going to stop people from practicing these bad habits, and they have bad consequences. But what did they do? They amended the Constitution. Can you imagine anybody today suggesting we have to amend the Constitution to run the drug war?
Drug war was started in the modern day drug war was started basically in the early 70s. And they have spent hundreds of billions of dollars on the drug war. We have more prisoners than anybody else in the world, and we have a lot of people who were put into these prisons. They were non-violent, and they come out very violent. So I say that it's time we allow people to make their own choices and suffer their own consequences. If they make bad choices, they can't come crawling to the government.
Congressman Paul, you say that the federal government should stay out of people's personal habits. You say marijuana, cocaine, even heroin should be legal if states want to permit it. You feel the same about prostitution and gay marriage. Question, sir, why should social conservatives in South Carolina vote for you for president?
Well, they will if they understand my defense of liberty is the defense of their right to practice their religion and say their prayers where they want and practice their life. But if you do not protect liberty across the board, it's a First Amendment type issue. We don't have a First Amendment so that we can talk about the weather. We have the First Amendment so we can say very controversial things. So for people to say that, yes, we have our religious beliefs protected, but people who want to follow something else or a controversial religion, you can't do this. If you have the inconsistency, then you're really not defending liberty. But there are strict rules on freedom of choice of this sort, because you can't hurt other people, you can't defame other people. But yes, you have a right to do things that are very controversial. If not, you're going to end up with government that's going to tell us what we can eat and drink and whatever. You know, it's amazing that we want freedom to pick the future, you know, our future in a spiritual way, but not when it comes to our personal habits.
But Senator, are you suggesting that heroin and prostitution are an exercise of liberty?
Well, you know, I probably never used those words. You put those words someplace. But yes, in essence, if I leave it to the states, it's going to be up to the states. Up until this past century, you know, for over 100 years they were legal. What you're inferring is, you know what? If we legalized heroin tomorrow, everybody's going to use heroin. How many people here would use heroin if it was legal? I bet nobody would put their hand, oh yeah, I need the government to take care of me. I don't want to use heroin, so I need these laws.
I never thought heroin would get applause here in South Carolina.
Today. As you know, after the Civil War, the Constitution was amended 3 times, and there were additional powers delegated to the national government. And I want to call attention particularly to the power delegated to the national government in the 5th section of the 14th Amendment, and that's the power to enforce the guarantees of privileges and immunities and due process and equal protection in the 1st section of the amendment. Now, I know that you have a strong and consistent pro-life voting record in the Congress. You believe in the inherent and equal dignity of all members of the human family, including the child in the womb. So I'm wondering whether, in view of those delegated powers, you would, as President, propose to Congress appropriate legislation pursuant to the 14th Amendment to protect life in all stages and conditions, or do you believe that you would have to wait for the Supreme Court to reverse itself in Roe versus Wade before you could do that?
No, I wouldn't wait for a constitutional amendment. I wouldn't wait for Roe versus Wade to be reversed, but I would, you know, remove the jurisdiction from the federal court so the states could immediately do what they want. And we wouldn't have wasted the last 10 years trying to stop the abortion. But when you refer and use the 14th Amendment, it implies that the 14th Amendment repealed the 9th and the 10th Amendment, and I don't quite read that into that, the people who use the 14th to do almost anything they want because it's now a federal government. And it is true, the 14th Amendment has been used to increase the size and scope of the federal government, which I disagree with because I think it should be held at the local level. But in no way should you interpret the 14th Amendment as repealing the 10th Amendment in particular.
Well, it's certainly true that any constitutional provision can be abused, and many of them have been abused. But the language of the 14th Amendment is very clear. It says that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or deny to any person the equal protection of the laws.
But if that were the case, they would have taken, no states would be involved in dealing with murder, injuries, second-degree murder, manslaughter, robbery, armed robbery. Everything is still states. So if you just can't pick out one, you should have no state laws against murder. Under your circumstances, this should be a federal issue.
Well, only if the murder laws are being denied to the protection of the murder laws are being denied to a class of people. So, for example, if the state withdrew its protections against killing, if the person killed is of a certain race or ethnic group, then certainly under the 14th Amendment, the national government would be empowered to act. So if it withdraws its protection, the state withdraws its protection from a class of human beings, let's say the unborn, or if it were the newly born or handicapped newborns, wouldn't that call for, not only permit, but call for action at the national level under Section 1 of the 14th Amendment?
If you wanted to stretch the interpretation and enhance the power of the central government rather than enhancing the power of the local government, because they deal with all acts of violence, I mean, I think they're quite capable of doing it. Some of these things are more difficult. Some states have capital punishment, some places don't, and I can understand your argument, but I think it really rejects the notion that the states were part of this republic that we created. So if you get gradualism of be sending more and more, soon as the Interstate Commerce Clause, soon as the General Welfare Clause, and I think when we can, and we certainly can, we've done it for all our history to deal with violence and murder. This has always been a state issue, and I don't see why we would have to turn that into a federal issue. Matter of fact, the founders never even thought we should have, a federal police force, but we do. We have a federal police force, and you're sort of asking for more policemen, at the federal level, and I don't understand why we've met so much resistance on returning the jurisdiction or removing the jurisdiction from the federal courts. If we'd have done that 10 years ago, you'd say millions and millions of abortions being done because the states could have prohibited it right away. You could have done it with a majority vote with the president signing it. You wouldn't have had to wait for the Constitution to be changed. You wouldn't have to wait for Roe versus Wade to be repealed by the court.
We have another question from Portsmouth, Virginia. Go ahead.
My name is Linda Gunn. I'm from Portsmouth, Virginia. I'm part of the Virginia Taxpayers Alliance. My question has to do with executive orders. Under what circumstances should a president sign an executive order, and how frequently should such an order be signed?
Congressman Paul.
The executive orders have been grossly abused by all administrations for a lot of years. But you can't. But some executive orders are legal. When the president executes proper function of the presidency, like moving troops and other things, yes, it's done with an executive order. But the executive order should never be used to legislate. That is what is so bad. So the executive order should be taken under control, and I made a promise, if as president, I would never use the executive order to legislate.
Thank you. Congressman Paul, we've been talking just now about Governor Perry's rhetoric, but let's talk about his record. Just this morning, your campaign put out a statement accusing him of pushing for bailout money, supporting welfare for illegal immigrants, and trying to forcibly vaccinate 12-year-old girls against sexually transmitted disease. He's your home state governor. Is he less conservative than meets the eye?
Much more so, yes. Just take the HPV. Forcing 12-year-old girls to take an inoculation to prevent this sexually transmitted disease. This is not good medicine, I do not believe. I think it's social misfit. It's not good social policy, and therefore I think this is very bad to do this. But one of the worst parts about that was the way it was done. The governorship in Texas traditionally is supposed to be a weak governorship. I didn't even know they could pass laws by writing an executive order. He did it with an executive order, passed it. The state was furious, and the legislature overwhelmingly, probably 90%, I don't know exactly, overwhelmingly repealed this. But I think it's the way it was passed, which was so bad. I think it's a bad piece of legislation, but I don't like the idea of executive orders. I, as president, will not use the executive order to write laws.
Congressman Paul, your answer is to cut both taxes and spending. You say that you would eliminate the IRS, the CIA, the Federal Reserve, the Department of Homeland Security, Medicare. I know that you used to want to end the FBI. I'm not sure whether you still support that idea, sir. Perhaps you can tell us. But if you get rid of the CIA, let alone the FBI, how would President Paul have any idea, any intelligence of what our enemies, foreign and domestic, are up to?
Well, you might ask a better question. Before 9/11, we were spending $40 billion a year, and the FBI was producing numerous information about people being trained on airplanes to fly them but not land them, and they totally ignored them. So it's the inefficiency of the bureaucracy the problem. So increasing this with the Department of Homeland Security and spending more money doesn't solve the problem. Yes, we have every right in the world to know something about intelligence gathering, but we have to have intelligent people interpreting this information. But you know, just going for increasing presidential powers, as been discussed, is rather disturbing to me. This whole idea that we're supposed to sacrifice liberty for security, we were advised against that. Don't we remember that when you sacrifice liberty for security, you lose both? That's what's happening in this country today. We have a national ID card on our doorsteps. It's being implemented right now. We have FISA courts. We have warrantless searches. We've lost habeas corpus. We've had secret prisons around the world, and we have torture going on. That's un-American, and we need to use the power of the presidency to get it back in order to take care of us and protect this country and our liberty.
Congressman Paul, this same line, you want to abolish the TSA. What would exist in its place?
Well, the airlines are responsible for carrying their cargo and their passengers. I mean, why should we assume that a bureaucracy can do better? And look at the monstrosity we have at the airports. These TSA agents are abusive. Sometimes they're accused of all kinds of sexual activities on the way they maul people at the airports. So the airlines could do that.
Your best at LAX tonight.
I would think the airlines should treat passengers as well as a company that hauls money around, and they protect their money. They have private guards, and they could do it. Just remember, 9/11 came about because there was too much government. Government was more or less in charge. They told the pilots they couldn't have guns, and they were told never to resist. They set up the stage for all this. So no, private markets do a good job in protecting, much better than this bureaucracy called the TSA. Let me tell you.
Let me ask you about something else. It's related in a way, has to do with Mother Nature. Before the broadcast, Senator Santorum's got flooding today in Pennsylvania. Governor Perry is just back from the wildfires out east. Category 1 storm laid waste to entire areas. There's standing water tonight, Paterson, New Jersey. Many of the towns around where I live, 8 days without power. We had people eating in outdoor and public parks because the supermarkets were closed down. The question is, federal aid, something like FEMA. If you object to what it's become and how's it's run, your position is to remove it, take it away, abolish it. What happens in its absence?
Well, what happened before 1979? We didn't have FEMA, and that FEMA just conditioned people to build where they shouldn't be building. We lose the market effect of that. But yeah, my position is we should have never had it. There's a much better way of doing it. I mean, this whole idea that the federal government can deal with weather and anything in the world, just go to the federal government. FEMA's broke. They're $20 billion in debt. But I'm not for saying tomorrow close it down. A lot of people pay the insurance. I worked real hard to make it work, and I did that in my district too. But I'll tell you how we should do it. We're spending, believe it or not, this blew my mind when I read this, $20 billion a year for air conditioning in
Afghanistan and Iraq in the tents over there and all the air conditioning. Cut that $20 billion out, bring it home, take 10 off the debt, and put 10 into FEMA or whoever else needs it, child health care or whatever. But I'll tell you what, if we did that and took the air conditioning out of the green zone, our troops would come home, and that would make me happy.
Congressman Paul, another gun issue for you, if you will. You have said that the 9/11 attackers might have had second thoughts if they'd felt that some of the passengers aboard the airplanes might have been armed. We have seen air flights diverted because people heard Arabic on planes, because they heard Muslims praying. What do you think it would do to the travel industry of this country if passengers felt others were carrying guns aboard, sir?
Well, first off, you're quoting me incorrectly.
I'm sorry.
I said the responsibility for protecting passengers falls with the airline, not the government, not the passengers. The airline's responsible for the aircraft and the passengers. If we wouldn't have been dependent on the federal government to set all the rules, which meant no guns and no resistance, then the terrorists may well have had second thoughts, because the airlines would have had the responsibility. But we assumed the government was going to take care of us. After 9/11, instead of moving toward the direction of personal responsibility and private property and Second Amendment, we moved in the opposite direction. We turned it over to the federal government, and look at the mess we have now at airports. I mean, the airlines, private industry protects their property all the time. People who haul around money in armored trucks protect their money all the time. But here is one example when the federal government was involved and they messed it up, and if we put the responsibility on the right people, respected the Second Amendment, I sincerely believe there would have been a lot less chance of 9/11 ever happening.